somewhere in the Taklamakan desert, buried beneath centuries of sand. There are still fragments of silk that once moved from hand to hand across 4,000 miles of mountain passes, caravanserais, and moonlit oases, threads that connected empires who would never see one another's faces. This is the story of that ancient network, a web of roots that carried not only bolts of shimmering fabric but also religions, recipes, diseases, and the slow mingling of languages spoken by merchants who learned to trust strangers in the dark. If these quiet histories bring some rest, perhaps consider subscribing. There will always be more slow journeys waiting here. The Silk Road was never a single road, of course, but a shifting constellation of paths that evolved over nearly 1,500 years. And to understand it fully, we begin in the courts of Han Dynasty China, where an emperor's curiosity set everything in motion. Long before the first bolt of silk ever journeyed westward from the workshops of ancient China, long before the great caravans would wind their way through mountain passes and across impossible deserts, there were already paths worn into the earth by traders carrying something far older and perhaps equally precious. These were the jade merchants, and their routes through Central Asia represent some of the earliest long-distance trade networks in human history, stretching back perhaps 5,000 years or more into the quiet depths of prehistory. The jade they carried came primarily from the riverbeds near Khotan, an oasis settlement nestled at the southern edge of the Taklamakan desert, and it made its way eastward to the courts and workshops of early Chinese civilization, where it was carved into ritual objects, ornaments, and symbols of authority that carried deep spiritual significance for the people who created them. The jade trade routes predated the movement of silk by several millennia, and they established patterns of travel and exchange that would later be followed by merchants carrying very different goods. The paths these early traders walked were not easy ones, for they led through some of the most challenging terrain on Earth, across high mountain passes and along the edges of deserts where water was scarce and the distances between safe stopping points could stretch for many difficult days. Yet the jade was valuable enough, and the demand for it persistent enough, that generations of traders continued to make these journeys, slowly building up the knowledge of routes and waypoints that would prove essential to later travelers. Archaeological evidence has revealed jade artifacts of Central Asian origin in Chinese contexts dating back to the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, suggesting that these connections between East and West are far older than many people realize. The story of what we now call the Silk Road, however, truly begins to take its more familiar shape during the reign of Emperor Wu of the Han Dynasty, who ruled China from 141 to 87 before the Common Era and whose ambitions would reshape the connections between East and West in ways that would endure for many centuries. Emperor Wu was a ruler of considerable energy and expansive vision, and he faced a persistent challenge along his northern frontiers in the form of the Xiongnu, a powerful confederation of nomadic peoples who posed a constant military threat to Chinese settlements and who had long extracted tribute from the Han court. The emperor sought allies against this enemy, and reports had reached him of a people called the Yuezhi, who had themselves been driven westward by the Xiongnu and who might, he hoped, be persuaded to form an alliance against their common foe. To find these potential allies and assess the possibilities for cooperation, Emperor Wu dispatched a diplomatic envoy in the year 138 before the Common Era. The man chosen for this mission was named Zhongqian, and his journey would become one of the most remarkable diplomatic expeditions in ancient history, though its most significant consequences were quite different from what anyone had originally intended. Zhongqian set out with a small party of around 100 men, crossing into the territories controlled by the Xiongnu, But his mission encountered immediate difficulty when his party was captured by the very people the Han court sought to outmaneuver. Rather than executing him, the Xiongnu held Zhong Qian as a captive, and there he would remain for approximately 13 years, far longer than anyone in the Han court could have anticipated or hoped. During his years of captivity, Zhong Qian married a Xiongnu woman and had a child, settling into what must have seemed like a permanent exile from his homeland and his original purpose. Yet he never abandoned his mission entirely, and when an opportunity finally arose, he escaped and continued westward in search of the Yuezhi. He found them eventually, settled now in the region of Bactria in what is today northern Afghanistan, but they had grown comfortable in their new homeland and had little interest in returning eastward to wage war against the Xiongnu. The diplomatic purpose of Zhong Qian's mission, then, was largely a failure, for he could not persuade the Yuezhi to ally with the Han against their old enemies. But what Zhong Qian brought back when he finally returned to China around 125 before the Common Era proved to be something far more valuable than any military alliance. Zhong Qian returned with detailed intelligence about the kingdoms and peoples of Central Asia, information that opened Chinese eyes to a wider world than they had previously imagined. He described the wealthy trading cities, the varied peoples, the agricultural products, and the goods that moved along the routes connecting these distant lands. Among the things that captured Emperor Wu's attention most intensely were reports of the magnificent horses bred in the Fergana Valley, in the kingdom the Chinese called Daiyuan. These Fergana horses, sometimes called heavenly horses in Chinese sources, were larger and stronger than the breeds available in China, and Emperor Wu believed they would give his cavalry a decisive advantage against the Xiongnu horsemen who had troubled his frontiers for so long. The emperor's desire for these horses would drive subsequent Han expansion westward and would help establish the regular connections that allowed the Silk Road trade to flourish. The term Silk Road itself is a relatively modern invention, coined not by any ancient merchant or traveler but by a 19th-century German geographer named Ferdinand von Richthofen. In 1877, Richthofen introduced the term Seidenstrasse, or Silk Road, in his scholarly writings about China and Central Asia, and the name captured something essential about these ancient trade routes while also, perhaps, simplifying a network that was always far more complex than any single road. The name stuck, and it remains the most common way of referring to these interconnected routes even today, though scholars have sometimes noted that silk was only one of many goods that moved along these paths, and that the routes themselves were multiple and shifting rather than forming any single fixed highway. The sophistication of Chinese silk production is magnificently illustrated by archaeological discoveries from the Mawangdui tombs, located near the city of Changsha in Yun Province. These tombs, dating to the 2nd century before the Common Era and thus roughly contemporary with Zhong Qian's travels, contained remarkably well-preserved textiles that demonstrate the extraordinary skill of Han Dynasty silk weavers. Among the discoveries was a silk gauze garment so fine and light that it weighed only 49 grams despite being over 120 centimeters in length, a fabric so sheer that it could be folded repeatedly into a small bundle that would fit in a matchbox. The Mawangdui silks include examples of complex weaving techniques, elaborate embroidery, and sophisticated dyeing methods that produced vivid colors still visible after more than 2,000 years. These textiles reveal that Chinese silk production had already reached an extraordinarily high level of refinement by the time the Silk Road trade began to flourish, and they help explain why silk became such a desired commodity in the courts and marketplaces of distant lands. The routes that merchants followed across Central Asia were shaped profoundly by geography, and no feature of that geography loomed larger than the Taklamakan Desert. This vast expanse of sand, located in the Tarim Basin in what is now the Xinjiang region of western China, presented travelers with one of the most formidable obstacles on Earth. The name Taklamakan has sometimes been translated as meaning "go in and you will not come out," though scholars have debated the accuracy of this interpretation. What is certain is that the desert's extreme aridity, its shifting sand dunes, and the great distances between water sources made direct crossings all but impossible for laden caravans. Instead, merchants developed two main routes that skirted the edges of the desert, following chains of oasis settlements where underground water sources or mountain runoff made human habitation possible. The northern route ran along the base of the Tian Shan Mountains, passing through oasis towns that clung to life where streams descended from the peaks. The southern route followed the northern edge of the Kunlun Mountains, connecting a different chain of oases that survived on water from the glacier and snowfields above. These two routes would converge at the western end of the Tarim Basin before continuing through the mountains toward the cities of Transoxiana and beyond. The geography of the Taklamakan thus shaped the entire structure of Silk Road trade, concentrating traffic through specific oasis settlements that grew wealthy and culturally rich as a result of their positions along these vital corridors. Among the most important of these oasis cities was Dunhuang, located at the eastern edge of the Taklamakan where the northern and southern routes diverged. Dunhuang served as a gateway, the last major Chinese settlement that westbound travelers would pass before entering the desert regions, and the first welcoming outpost that eastbound merchants would reach after their long journey. The city became a center of Buddhist scholarship and art, and the famous Mogoro caves nearby contain centuries of accumulated religious paintings and sculptures that reflect the cultural exchanges fostered by Silk Road trade. Further west, the city of Kasha occupied an equally strategic position at the western end of the Tarim Basin, where routes from different directions converged before continuing over the mountain passes into Central Asia proper. Kasha became one of the great marketplaces of the medieval world, a city where traders from many different cultures met and exchanged goods and ideas. Beyond the mountain passes, the route continued to the fabled city of Samarkand, located in the fertile valley of the Zarafshan River in what is now Uzbekistan. Samarkand was already an ancient city by the time of the Silk Road's flourishing, and its position at the heart of the Transoxiana region made it a natural hub for commerce flowing in all directions. The city's workshops produced fine goods that were traded across the known world, and its markets offered merchandise from China, India, Persia, and the Mediterranean lands. Samarkand would remain a center of culture and commerce for many centuries, passing through the hands of many different rulers while maintaining its importance as a waypoint on the great trade routes. The legend that Zhongqian brought back grapes, alfalfa, and pomegranates to China from his western travels reflects the broader pattern of biological and agricultural exchange that accompanied the movement of merchants along the Silk Road. Whether Zhongqian himself was directly responsible for introducing these plants to China, as traditional accounts suggest, remains uncertain, for the historical evidence is not always clear on such details. What is certain is that the period following his journeys saw the introduction of many new crops and plants to China from Central and Western Asia, including grapes for wine production, alfalfa as fodder for horses, pomegranates for their fruit, and various other species that would become important parts of Chinese agriculture and cuisine. This exchange of plants and agricultural knowledge represents one of the quieter but most lasting consequences of the connections that the Silk Road established. The routes that would come to be called the Silk Road were thus not the creation of any single moment or any single person, but rather the gradual accumulation of knowledge, the slow establishment of waypoints and relationships, the patient wearing of paths through difficult country by generations of traders and travelers. The jade merchants who walked these routes millennia before the Han Dynasty expansion laid the groundwork. Zhongqian's mission provided crucial intelligence and sparked imperial interest in the Western lands, and the desire for Fergana horses gave Emperor Wu a practical reason to extend Han influence along the routes. The oasis cities that grew up along the edges of the Taklamakan provided essential services and became centers of cultural exchange in their own right. And the silk that gave the routes their modern name, woven with such skill in the workshops of China, provided a commodity so desirable and so light relative to its value that it was worth carrying across thousands of kilometers of mountain and desert to reach the markets of the West. These were the beginnings, the first footsteps on paths that would be walked by countless others in the centuries to follow. The routes would grow busier and more elaborate, the goods more varied, the cultural exchanges more profound, but all of it rested on foundations laid in these early centuries, by jade traders whose names are lost to history, by a diplomat who spent 13 years as a captive before completing his mission, and by an emperor who wanted horses for his cavalry and ended up opening windows onto worlds his people had never imagined. And so we come now to one of the quieter revolutions in human history, a change that unfolded not through conquest or treaty, but through the careful concealment of tiny eggs, no larger than grains of sand, carried across thousands of miles of mountain and desert by travelers whose names we may never know with certainty. This is the story of how China's greatest secret, guarded for more than 3,000 years through laws of extraordinary severity, eventually slipped beyond its borders and changed the economies of the ancient world in ways that would take centuries to fully appreciate. For the better part of 3 millennia, the Chinese Empire maintained what we might describe as history's most successful trade monopoly, controlling not merely the sale of silk but the entire knowledge of how this remarkable fiber came to exist at all. To foreign merchants who purchased bolts of shimmering fabric in the markets of Chang'an or Luoyang, the origins of silk remained genuinely mysterious, and the Chinese authorities preferred it that way, understanding as they did that a secret ingredient fetches a far higher price than one that any determined craftsperson might replicate. The penalties for revealing the methods of sericulture, which is simply the technical term for the cultivation of silkworms and the harvesting of their cocoons, were among the harshest in Chinese law, and it was understood throughout the empire that anyone caught attempting to smuggle silkworm eggs, or the seeds of the white mulberry trees upon which the worms depended, or even detailed knowledge of the rearing process itself, would face execution, and not merely their own execution, but potentially that of their entire family as well. This severity reflected the genuine economic importance of silk to the Chinese state, for this was not merely one trade good among many, but rather the foundation of considerable imperial wealth and diplomatic influence, the means by which tributary relationships were maintained with neighboring peoples, and the source of foreign currency in the form of gold and silver that flowed eastward along the trade routes in exchange for bales of fabric heading west. The origins of silk production are lost in the comfortable haze of Chinese mythology, though the traditional account, which has been repeated for thousands of years and which Chinese schoolchildren once learned as readily as Western children learned of their own national legends, centers upon a princess named Xiling Shua, who is said to have lived around 2,700 years before the Common Era, during the reign of the Yellow Emperor, Huangdi, one of the legendary founding figures of Chinese civilization. According to this gentle tale, The young princess was taking tea beneath a mulberry tree when a cocoon fell from the branches above and landed in her cup. And as she attempted to fish it out, the hot liquid loosened the fibers, and she found herself unwinding a single continuous thread of remarkable length and luster. And in this accidental way, or so the legend tells us, the secret of silk was first revealed to humanity. Whether any portion of this story reflects historical events we cannot say, and it seems likely that the discovery of silk was rather more gradual and rather less poetic, involving the slow accumulation of knowledge across generations of anonymous workers who observed the behavior of wild silkworms and learned, through patient experimentation, how to domesticate these creatures and harvest their fibers in useful quantities. What we can say with more confidence is that by the time the earliest written Chinese records emerge, silk production was already well established, already surrounded by ritual and regulation, and already understood to be a matter of considerable importance to the state. And so for century after century, the secret held. Foreign traders came and went along the routes we now call the Silk Road, carrying bolts of fabric to markets in Persia and India and eventually to Rome itself, where silk commanded prices literally worth its weight in gold. And yet none of these traders, or at least none whose activities left any record, succeeded in discovering how the fabric was made. Various theories circulated in the Western world, some suggesting that silk grew on trees like cotton, others proposing that it was combed from the leaves of certain plants, and still others believing it to be the product of some animal whose nature remained unclear. The Greek geographer Strabo believed silk came from the bark of certain trees, while Pliny the Elder wrote confidently about silken fleece being combed from forest leaves, which tells us how thoroughly the Chinese had succeeded in keeping their secret. This state of affairs might have continued indefinitely had it not been for the ambitions of a Byzantine emperor named Justinian I, who ruled from Constantinople in the 6th century of the Common Era and who looked upon the silk trade with a mixture of appreciation and frustration. The Byzantine Empire was by this time a major consumer of silk, which was used not merely for clothing but for religious vestments, imperial ceremonial garments, and diplomatic gifts of considerable significance. And yet all of this silk had to be purchased from Persia, through whose territory the overland trade routes passed, and the Persians, being shrewd merchants themselves, were content to serve as middlemen and to take a substantial profit from each transaction. Justinian found this arrangement irksome, both because of the cost involved and because of the political vulnerability it created. For any disruption to Byzantine-Persian relations would threaten the empire's silk supply, and such disruptions were becoming increasingly common as the two great powers competed for influence across the Near East. What the emperor desired, therefore, was nothing less than an independent Byzantine silk industry, one that would free his empire from Persian dependency and allow Constantinople to become a manufacturing center rather than merely a market. The difficulty, of course, was that no one in the Byzantine world knew how silk was made, and the Chinese showed no inclination to share their knowledge. And so Justinian turned to a method that we would today call industrial espionage, though the term itself would not be coined for many centuries yet. The exact details of what followed remain somewhat uncertain, as the surviving accounts were written some years after the events they describe, but the general outline of the story is accepted by most historians, even if some of the more colorful particulars may be embroidered. According to the Byzantine historian Procopius, who wrote during Justinian's reign, certain monks from India appeared at Constantinople around the year 552 of the Common Era, claiming knowledge of how silk might be produced and offering to obtain the necessary materials if the emperor would sponsor their expedition. These monks were almost certainly Nestorian Christians, members of a branch of Christianity that had spread eastward along the trade routes and established communities as far away as China itself, and their familiarity with the silk-producing regions would have been considerably greater than that of most Byzantine subjects. Justinian, eager for any possibility of breaking the silk monopoly, agreed to sponsor their mission, and the monks departed on their long journey eastward, traveling not to China itself, which would have been too dangerous given the severity of Chinese laws, but to the kingdom of Khotan, a Buddhist kingdom situated along the southern branch of the Silk Road in what is now western China. Khotan had by this time acquired silk production of its own, though exactly when and how this happened is itself a matter of some debate. And it is from Khotan that the monks allegedly obtained the precious cargo they would carry back to Constantinople. The method of concealment, according to the traditional account, was elegantly simple. The monks hollowed out their bamboo walking sticks, the kind of staff that any traveler might carry for support on a long journey, and within these hollow compartments they placed silkworm eggs, protecting them from damage and concealing them from inspection. They may also have carried seeds of the white mulberry tree, upon whose leaves the silkworms depend for food, though this detail varies between different versions of the story. The journey back to Constantinople would have taken many months, and the monks would have needed to time their travel carefully. 4 silkworm eggs must be kept at appropriate temperatures and protected from excessive moisture or dryness if they are to remain viable. Yet apparently the monks succeeded, for they arrived at Constantinople with their cargo intact, and the eggs hatched, and the Byzantine silk industry was born. There exists, however, an alternative legend regarding how silk first escaped Chinese control, and this version places the events considerably earlier and in a somewhat more romantic context. According to this tale, which is recorded in both Chinese and Khotanese sources, a Chinese princess was sent to marry the king of Khotan sometime around the 5th century of the Common Era, a diplomatic marriage of the kind that frequently cemented alliances between states along the Silk Road. Knowing that she would miss the silken fabrics of her homeland, and perhaps also understanding the economic value of what she carried, the princess is said to have concealed silkworm eggs and mulberry seeds within her elaborate headdress, the one item of her possessions that border guards would not dare to search, given the sacred nature of a bride's wedding attire. Whether this story is true, or whether it was invented later to explain Khotan's silk industry through a more poetic narrative than simple smuggling, we cannot determine with certainty. What we do know is that by the time the Byzantine monks arrived in Khotan, silk was already being produced there, suggesting that the Chinese monopoly had been broken at least once before, even if the secret had not yet spread to the Mediterranean world. The establishment of silk production in Constantinople had consequences that unfolded over many decades. The Byzantine Empire did not immediately become self-sufficient in silk, for the art of sericulture requires not merely eggs and seeds, but also generations of accumulated knowledge about the proper conditions for raising silkworms, the precise timing of harvests, and the intricate processes of reeling, spinning, and weaving that transform raw fiber into finished fabric. The early Byzantine silk was apparently of inferior quality compared to Chinese production, and Chinese silk continued to command premium prices in Mediterranean markets for many years to come. Nevertheless, the monopoly had been broken, and over time the Byzantine industry improved, and eventually Constantinople became famous for its own silk workshops, producing fabrics of distinctive character that were prized throughout the medieval world. From Constantinople, the knowledge of sericulture spread further, reaching Persia and the Arab world, and eventually the cities of Syria, where the weavers of Damascus developed their own traditions of silk manufacture, giving us the word damask, which we still use today to describe certain patterns of woven fabric, though we rarely think of the ancient city whose craftspeople first made such cloth famous. The spread of silk production eastward from China followed different channels, moving through Korea to Japan along routes that were distinct from those that carried the secret westward to Byzantium. Korean silk production appears to have developed through direct contact with China, facilitated by the proximity of the Korean peninsula and the long history of cultural and commercial exchange between Korean kingdoms and their larger neighbor. Japanese sericulture, in turn, is traditionally traced to the late 5th or early 6th century of the Common Era, when emigrants from Korea are said to have brought silkworms and weaving techniques across the narrow strait separating the two lands. The economic consequences of this diffusion of knowledge were felt most strongly, of course, in China itself, where the silk trade had been a source of wealth and prestige for so many centuries. As production centers multiplied across Eurasia, the unique value of Chinese silk was inevitably diminished, for though Chinese craftspeople maintained their reputation for superior quality, they could no longer command the extraordinary prices that had prevailed when theirs was the only source. The rivers of gold and silver that had once flowed eastward along the Silk Road became smaller streams, and while China remained an important producer of silk, it was no longer the sole guardian of the secret, the only point of light in a world of ignorance. And yet we might observe, settling further into our pillows with the calm perspective of history, that this change, though significant, did not destroy the Chinese silk trade so much as transform it. Silk continued to move along the ancient routes, and Chinese silk continued to find buyers who appreciated its quality, even as other silks from other lands found their own markets and their own admirers. The world had become a little more interconnected, a little more equal in its distribution of useful knowledge, and though this was not a change that Chinese authorities had welcomed or permitted, it was perhaps an inevitable consequence of the long centuries of contact and exchange that the Silk Road had fostered. And now we come to a people whose name you may never have heard before, and yet whose influence shaped the flow of goods and ideas across thousands of kilometers for half a millennium, quietly and persistently, like water finding its way through stone. These were the Sogdians, a people who lived in the river valleys of what we now call Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, and who became, for a time, the most successful merchants the ancient world had ever known. Their story is one of patient accumulation, of careful networks built across generations, of families scattered along the length of the Silk Road who nonetheless maintained their connections through letters and marriages and the steady exchange of goods and news. If the great empires of Rome and China were the anchors at either end of the trade routes, the Sogdians were the rope itself, the living thread that made long-distance commerce not merely possible but reliable. The land from which the Sogdians came was blessed with fertile river valleys fed by snowmelt from distant mountains, and their cities grew prosperous from agriculture long before they became famous for trade. Samarkand was the greatest of these cities, situated in the valley of the Zaravshan River, whose name means gold-bearing, though the true gold of the region would prove to be its location rather than any metal washed down from the heights. Bukhara lay to the west, another oasis of cultivation in the semi-arid landscape, and Panjakant to the east, smaller but no less sophisticated, as we shall see when we speak of its remarkable painted walls. These cities were never unified into a single kingdom in the way we might expect, but rather existed as independent city-states, each ruled by its own king or council, bound together by language and culture and family ties rather than by any central authority. This arrangement, which might seem a weakness from a military perspective, proved remarkably well suited to the demands of long-distance trade, where flexibility and local knowledge mattered far more than the ability to field large armies. The Sogdians had been merchants for centuries, but their dominance of the Silk Road trade began in earnest around the 5th century of the Common Era and continued until approximately the year 1000, a span of 500 years during which no journey along the great trade routes was complete without passing through Sogdian hands or relying upon Sogdian expertise. They established trading colonies in cities from the Mediterranean to the China Sea, communities of merchants and their families who maintained their Sogdian identity even as they adapted to local customs, learned local languages, and integrated themselves into the commercial life of their host cities. These colonies were not mere temporary encampments but permanent settlements, with temples and cemeteries, schools where children learned to read and write Sogdian script, and elaborate networks of correspondence that kept distant relatives informed of prices and opportunities and family news. We know of these networks in remarkable detail thanks to a discovery made in the year 1907 by the archaeologist Aurel Stein, who was exploring the ruins of a Chinese watchtower near the oasis town of Dunhuang, at the eastern end of the Taklamakan desert. There, in a mailbag that had never reached its destination, preserved by the dry desert air for more than 1600 years, Stein found a collection of letters written on paper and silk, folded and sealed, addressed to merchants in Samarkand but abandoned, for reasons we can only guess, in this lonely outpost on the edge of the Chinese world. These documents, known today as the Sogdian Ancient Letters, date to the year 313 of the Common Era, and they offer us an extraordinarily intimate glimpse into the lives of Sogdian merchants and their families at a moment of crisis. The letters reveal a world of intricate business arrangements and deep personal feeling, of fortunes made and lost, of families separated by vast distances but connected by bonds of obligation and affection. One letter, written by a woman named Milne, describes her desperate situation after being abandoned by her husband in a Chinese city far from home, without money or support, unable to return to her family and unable to survive where she was. Her words are practical and emotional in equal measure, concerned with debts and travel arrangements but also with the shame she feels at her predicament and her worry for her daughter, who is also stranded. Another letter discusses the destruction wrought by nomadic invaders who had recently sacked the city of Luoyang, ending with the bleak observation that as far as the writer knew, there was no longer any profit to be made in China. So complete was the devastation. These were real people facing real hardships, and their letters remind us that the Silk Road was not merely an abstraction of scholarly interest but a living network of human beings whose fortunes rose and fell with the tides of history. The success of Sogdian merchants rested not only on their geographic position and their willingness to travel, but also on a series of innovations in commercial practice that made long-distance trade safer and more predictable. Among these innovations were letters of credit, documents that allowed a merchant to deposit money with a trusted agent in one city and withdraw an equivalent sum from another agent hundreds or even thousands of kilometers away, thus avoiding the considerable dangers of carrying gold or silver through bandit-infested territories. The Sogdians also developed forms of caravan insurance, arrangements by which multiple merchants would share the risk of a journey, so that the loss of a single camel or even an entire caravan would not mean the ruin of any individual investor. These practices required trust and record-keeping and a shared set of expectations about how disputes would be resolved. And the Sogdian trading network provided all of these things, creating a kind of invisible infrastructure that made commerce possible even in the absence of any overarching political authority. The language that facilitated this commerce was Sogdian itself, an Iranian tongue written in a graceful script derived ultimately from Aramaic, and for several centuries it served as the common language of trade across much of Central Asia. Merchants who might have no other language in common could conduct their business in Sogdian, and the inscriptions and graffiti left by travelers along the Silk Road routes testify to the widespread use of this language far beyond the borders of Sogdia proper. Buddhist texts were translated into Sogdian for communities of believers in Central Asia, and even the early writings of the Manichaean religion, which had its origins in Mesopotamia, were disseminated along the trade routes in Sogdian translation. The language served as a vehicle not only for commercial correspondence but for religious ideas and literary expression, binding together a vast and diverse region in a web of shared communication. The religion of the Sogdians themselves was a form of Zoroastrianism, the ancient Iranian faith that venerated fire as a symbol of truth and righteousness. Though Sogdian religious practice had its own distinctive features that set it apart from the Zoroastrianism of Iran proper. The Sogdians built fire temples and maintained sacred flames, but they also developed unique funerary customs in which the bones of the dead, once the flesh had been stripped away by exposure or by the beaks of carrion birds, were collected and placed in small stone or ceramic containers called ossuaries, which were then deposited in family tombs. These ossuaries were often decorated with elaborate carved scenes depicting the journey of the soul to the afterlife, or with images of the deceased surrounded by mourning relatives. And the artistry of these objects speaks to a culture deeply concerned with the proper treatment of the dead and the maintenance of family memory across generations. The Sogdian diaspora brought these customs and beliefs to distant lands, but it also brought more immediately appealing gifts in the form of music and dance. The merchants and entertainers who traveled from Central Asia to the cities of Tang Dynasty China introduced new instruments, new melodies, and new ways of moving the body that captivated Chinese audiences and transformed Chinese court culture. The pipa, a pear-shaped lute with a bent neck, became one of the most beloved instruments in Chinese music, though its origins lay in Central Asia and its introduction to China was largely the work of Sogdian musicians. The dances that accompanied this music were equally influential, characterized by rapid spinning movements and acrobatic leaps that seemed exotic and exciting to Chinese observers. And the fashion for Central Asian entertainment at the Tang court created opportunities for Sogdian performers that lasted for generations. The city of Chang'an, the Tang capital and the greatest city in the world at that time, was home to a substantial Sogdian community whose members included not only merchants and musicians but also soldiers and officials who had risen to positions of influence in the Chinese administration. Among these was a man named Lushan, born around the year 703 to a Sogdian father and a Turkic mother, who rose through the ranks of the Tang military to become one of the most powerful generals in the empire. Lushan was a large man, reportedly of considerable girth, known for his entertaining manner and his ability to ingratiate himself with the Emperor Xuanzong and the imperial favorite, Yang Guifei. He commanded vast armies along the northeastern frontier and enjoyed the emperor's trust to a degree that alarmed many courtiers, who saw in his accumulation of power the seeds of future trouble. Their fears proved justified in the year 755, when An Lushan launched a rebellion that would shake the Tang dynasty to its foundations and change the course of Chinese history. His armies swept south from the frontier, capturing the secondary capital of Luoyang with terrifying speed. And within months the emperor himself had fled Chang'an, abandoning his capital to the rebels. The An Lushan Rebellion, as it came to be known, lasted until 763, 8 years of devastating warfare that killed millions and left the Tang dynasty permanently weakened, though it would stagger on for another century and a half before its final collapse. An Lushan himself did not survive to see the end of the conflict, murdered by his own son in 757, but the rebellion he had begun continued under other leaders, and the devastation it caused reshaped the political landscape of East Asia. The connection between An Lushan and the broader Sogdian community was complex and ambivalent, for many Sogdians remained loyal to the Tang and suffered greatly when Chinese resentment of the rebellion turned against all those associated with Central Asian culture. The fashion for Sogdian music and dance cooled noticeably after the rebellion, and the Sogdian communities that had flourished in Chinese cities found themselves regarded with suspicion rather than welcome. Yet the Sogdian presence in China did not disappear entirely, and the cultural influences they had introduced continued to shape Chinese art and music for centuries to come, even as the Sogdians themselves gradually assimilated into the surrounding populations. The finest visual record of Sogdian culture at its height comes not from China but from the ruined city of Afrasiab, the ancient precursor to Samarkand, where Soviet archaeologists in the 1960s discovered a series of wall paintings of astonishing beauty and historical significance. These murals, dating to around the year 660 of the Common Era, decorated the reception hall of a wealthy Sogdian aristocrat or perhaps a royal palace, and they depict scenes of diplomatic and ceremonial life with a vividness that takes the breath away. Ambassadors from China and Korea and the Turkic steppe are shown arriving with gifts, their distinctive clothing and hairstyles carefully rendered, while Sogdian nobles in elaborate robes receive them with appropriate ceremony. The paintings offer a window into a world of sophisticated court culture, of cosmopolitan connections reaching across continents, of a people confident in their place at the center of a vast trading network. And yet within a few centuries of these paintings being made, the Sogdians as a distinct people had effectively ceased to exist, absorbed into the Turkic and Persian populations that came to dominate Central Asia, their language forgotten, their cities fallen into ruin. The Arab conquests of the 7th and 8th centuries brought Islam to the region and began the slow process of cultural transformation, but it was the Mongol invasions of the 13th century that delivered the final blow, devastating the cities and disrupting the trade networks that had sustained Sogdian prosperity. The caravans still passed through Samarkand and Bukhara, but the merchants who led them now spoke Turkic or Persian, and the name Sogdian was remembered only in old inscriptions and fragmentary texts. A people who had once dominated the commerce of half the world had vanished, leaving behind only their art, their letters, and the musical instruments that still sing in Chinese orchestras today. Along the ancient trade routes that we have been following, something far more delicate than silk was also being carried from place to place, something weightless yet profound, something that could not be taxed at customs posts or weighed on merchant scales. Ideas were traveling, and among the most significant of these were religious beliefs, moving slowly and gently across mountains and deserts, finding new homes in distant lands, and transforming as they went, much as a river changes character as it flows through different landscapes while remaining, in essence, the same water. Buddhism began its long journey eastward from the Indian subcontinent, where it had emerged in the 5th or 6th century before the Common Era, based on the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama, who came to be known as the Buddha, meaning the awakened one. The religion spread first within India itself, and then, gradually, it began to move northward and westward, into the region known as Gandhara, which occupied parts of what are now Pakistan and Afghanistan. Gandhara was a place of remarkable cultural mixing, where the influences of India, Persia, and the Hellenistic world that Alexander of Macedon had left behind all came together in a gentle mingling, and it was here that Buddhism began to develop new forms of artistic expression, new ways of depicting the Buddha and his teachings that would prove enormously influential as the religion continued its journey eastward. The transmission of Buddhism along the Silk Road was not a single event but rather a slow and continuous process, taking place over many centuries, carried forward by monks and merchants, by pilgrims and scholars, by ordinary travelers who happened to carry with them not only goods but also stories and beliefs. By the 1st century of the Common Era, Buddhism had reached China, arriving through the mountain passes and along the desert tracks that connected the oasis towns of Central Asia to the western frontiers of the Chinese Empire. The religion found a receptive audience in some quarters, though it also faced resistance and skepticism in others, for it was, after all, a foreign teaching, and its ideas about monasticism and withdrawal from worldly life did not always sit easily alongside traditional Chinese values concerning family and social obligation. The Kushan Empire played a particularly important role in this process of religious transmission, serving as a kind of cultural hub through which Buddhist teachings and art forms passed on their way eastward. The Kushans were a people of possibly Central Asian origin who established a powerful empire in the 1st centuries of the Common Era, encompassing parts of present-day Afghanistan, Pakistan, and northern India. Under the rule of Kanishk I, who reigned sometime in the late 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era, the exact dates being a matter of scholarly discussion, the Kushan Empire became a major patron of Buddhism, and Kanishk himself is remembered in Buddhist tradition as a great protector of the faith. The empire's position astride the trade routes meant that it facilitated not only the movement of silk and spices and precious stones, but also the movement of religious ideas and artistic styles. And it was through the Kushan lands that much of the Buddhist art and literature that would later flourish in China first passed. One of the most remarkable monuments to the spread of Buddhism along the Silk Road can be found at Dunhuang, an oasis town in the Gobi Desert, in what is now the Gansu province of China. Here, at a site known as the Mogoro Caves, or sometimes as the Caves of 1,000 Buddhas, Buddhist devotees carved temples into the cliff faces over a period spanning more than 1,000 years, beginning around the year 366 of the Common Era and continuing until approximately 1400. There are 492 caves at Dunhuang containing temples and shrines, and the walls of these caves are covered with paintings and sculptures depicting Buddhist themes, the whole complex representing one of the most important repositories of Buddhist art anywhere in the world. The caves were created by monks and by wealthy patrons, by local rulers and by ordinary pilgrims, each contributing according to their means to the creation of a sacred space in the midst of the vast and unforgiving desert, a place where travelers on the Silk Road could stop and pray and seek spiritual comfort before continuing on their long and difficult journeys. Buddhism was not the only religion to travel the Silk Road, for the trade routes served as channels for many different systems of belief, each finding its way eastward through the movement of people and the exchange of ideas. Christianity, too, made the journey, though in a form that might seem unfamiliar to many modern Christians. Nestorian Christianity, which took its name from Nestorius, a 5th-century patriarch of Constantinople whose theological views were condemned by church councils in the West, spread eastward along the trade routes, carried by missionaries and merchants into Persia and Central Asia and eventually into China itself. By the year 635 of the Common Era, Nestorian missionaries had reached Chang'an, the great capital of the Tang Dynasty, where they were received by the emperor and permitted to establish a monastery and to preach their faith. The presence of Nestorian Christianity in Tang China is documented by a remarkable artifact known as the Elevanan Stele, a large stone tablet that was erected in the year 781 of the Common Era in the city of Chang'an, which is known today as Elevanan. The stele is inscribed with a lengthy text, written in both Chinese and Syriac, describing the arrival of Christianity in China and outlining its basic teachings in terms that Chinese readers might understand and appreciate. The text speaks of the religion as the luminous teaching, and it describes how the missionary Alopan brought the scriptures from the West and was welcomed by the Tang Emperor Taizong, who examined the teachings and found them worthy of being propagated throughout the empire. The stele remained buried for many centuries before being rediscovered in the 17th century, and it now stands as one of the most important pieces of evidence for the early spread of Christianity into East Asia. Another religion that traveled the Silk Road was Manichaeism, a faith founded in the 3rd century of the Common Era by a Persian prophet named Mani, who sought to create a universal religion that would synthesize elements of Zoroastrianism, Christianity, and Buddhism. Manichaeism was based on a dualistic cosmology, a view of the universe as divided between the forces of light and darkness, and its followers believed in the importance of liberating the particles of light that were trapped within the material world. The religion spread both westward into the Roman Empire and eastward along the trade routes into Central Asia and China, where it gained followers among various peoples. In the year 762 of the Common Era, Manichaeism achieved a remarkable success when it was adopted as the state religion of the Uyghur Khaganate, a powerful Central Asian empire centered on the steppes of what is now Mongolia. The Uyghur ruler, having received assistance from a Manichaean community during a time of political crisis, converted to the faith and promoted it throughout his realm, making the Uyghur Khaganate the only state in history to have Manichaeism as its official religion. Jewish communities also established themselves along the Silk Road, and among the most notable of these was the community at Kaifeng, a city in central China that served for a time as the capital of the northern Song dynasty. The origins of the Kaifeng Jews are somewhat obscure, with various theories suggesting they may have arrived from Persia or India or Central Asia, perhaps during the Tang or Song periods, and they maintained their religious identity for many centuries, building a synagogue and preserving their traditions even as they gradually became culturally Chinese in other respects. The community eventually declined and lost much of its distinct religious practice, but its existence serves as a reminder of how far-reaching the connections of the Silk Road truly were, bringing peoples from distant lands to settle and live and worship in the heart of China. Islam, too, spread eastward along the trade routes, though its arrival in Central Asia and China is often associated with a specific historical event, the Battle of Talas, which took place in the year 751 of the Common Era. At Talas, in what is now Kazakhstan, the forces of the Tang dynasty of China met the armies of the Abbasid Caliphate, and the result was a decisive victory for the Abbasid forces. The battle itself did not lead to any significant territorial changes, for neither empire sought to expand into the other's lands, but it is often seen as marking a turning point in the cultural orientation of Central Asia, which thereafter came increasingly under Islamic influence. In the centuries that followed, Islam spread gradually through the region, carried by merchants and missionaries and scholars, until it became the dominant religion across much of the territory that the Silk Road traversed. Zoroastrianism, the ancient religion of Persia, also maintained a presence along the trade routes, with fire temples established in various locations where Persian merchants and communities had settled. Zoroastrians venerated fire as a symbol of the divine, and their temples contained sacred flames that were kept perpetually burning, tended by priests who maintained the rituals and prayers of their faith. Although Zoroastrianism did not spread as widely or as successfully as some of the other religions that traveled the Silk Road, its communities maintained their traditions in various places along the routes, contributing to the remarkable religious diversity that characterized the great trading cities of the medieval period. The city of Chang'an during the Tang Dynasty offers perhaps the most striking example of the religious tolerance that could prevail along the Silk Road. This great city, one of the largest in the world at that time, was home to temples and places of worship belonging to many different faiths, all existing side by side within the same urban space. Buddhist monasteries stood alongside Taoist temples, and both were neighbors to the Nestorian Christian church, the Zoroastrian fire temple, and the Manichaean house of worship. The Tang emperors, while favoring Taoism as a native Chinese tradition, generally permitted the practice of foreign religions, recognizing perhaps that the prosperity of the empire depended in part on the goodwill of the many foreign merchants who came to trade in its cities. This atmosphere of relative tolerance allowed for the exchange not only of goods but also of ideas, and it created the conditions in which different religious traditions could interact and influence one another. The art that emerged from these interactions provides some of the most tangible evidence of how religions transformed as they traveled. In Gandhara, where Buddhism flourished under the Kushan Empire, artists developed a distinctive style that combined Indian Buddhist iconography with Greco-Roman artistic techniques, a legacy of the Hellenistic kingdoms that had once ruled the region. The Buddha was depicted in the style of a Greek god, with flowing robes and naturalistic facial features, and these images influenced the way the Buddha would be portrayed for centuries to come as Buddhism spread into China and beyond. Chinese Buddhist art drew upon these Gandharan models while also incorporating native Chinese artistic traditions, creating new styles that were neither purely Indian nor purely Chinese but something original, something that could only have emerged from the meeting of cultures that the Silk Road made possible. And so we see that the Silk Road was not merely an avenue for commerce, though commerce certainly flowed along it in great abundance. It was also a channel for the movement of beliefs, for the transmission of sacred texts and artistic styles and religious practices, for the gentle spreading of ideas that shaped the spiritual lives of millions of people across thousands of miles and hundreds of years. The prophets and teachers and missionaries who traveled these routes were carrying something precious, something that they believed offered meaning and comfort and truth, and they carried it with the same determination and patience that the merchants showed in transporting their bales of silk and their sacks of spices. And just as the goods that moved along the Silk Road were transformed by their journey, acquiring value and significance as they passed from hand to hand, so too were the religions that traveled these paths transformed, adapting to new cultures, blending with local traditions, becoming something new while remaining, in their essential teachings, something ancient and enduring. And now we turn to a quieter chapter in our story, one that moves slowly through the centuries and concerns itself with the invisible passengers who traveled the same dusty roads as the silk merchants and the Buddhist pilgrims. The same mountain passes and the same caravanserai courtyards where traders rested their camels and shared their evening meals. These passengers were microorganisms, tiny beyond imagining, and they moved from host to host along the networks of human connection that the Silk Road had so patiently woven across the breadth of Asia and into the Mediterranean world. It is a somber subject, perhaps, but we shall approach it gently, as we approach all things in these late hours, with calm attention to the facts and a steady, unhurried pace that suits the darkness outside your window. The great trade routes that connected Chang'an to Rome, and all the cities and villages and pastoral encampments in between, were arteries through which flowed not only goods and ideas and religious teachings, but also pathogens that had never before encountered certain human populations. This is the paradox of connectivity, which we shall explore together as you settle deeper into your pillow, and it is simply this. The same roads that brought prosperity and cultural exchange and beautiful objects crafted in distant workshops also brought suffering and death, carried by fleas in the fur of rats, by droplets in the breath of infected travelers, by the invisible contamination of goods passed from hand to hand across thousands of miles. The caravans that enriched the cities of the ancient world also, from time to time, brought them to their knees. Let us begin with the Antonine Plague, which descended upon the Roman Empire during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, that philosopher-emperor whose meditations you may have encountered in your waking hours, and which lasted from approximately 165 CE until 180 CE, though some scholars extend its duration even further into the following decades. The disease appears to have arrived from the east, brought back to Rome by soldiers returning from campaigns in the Parthian territories, those same borderlands where Roman and Eastern influences mingled and where the western terminus of the Silk Road trade connected to Mediterranean shipping networks. Contemporary accounts describe symptoms that many modern historians and epidemiologists believe are consistent with smallpox or measles, though we cannot be entirely certain across such vast distances of time. The physician Galen, who observed the plague firsthand and whose medical writings would influence European medicine for over 1,000 years, described fever and pustular skin eruptions, and these descriptions have guided modern analysis of what pathogen might have been responsible. The death toll was immense by any measure, with estimates suggesting that between 5 and 10 million people perished throughout the Roman Empire during those terrible years. Perhaps 1/4 or even 1/3 of the population in the most severely affected regions. Soldiers died in their camps, their ranks thinned before they could meet any enemy in battle. Farmers died in their fields, and the agricultural labor that sustained the empire grew scarce. Prices rose. Tax revenues fell. The long, slow process that historians sometimes call the decline of Rome cannot be attributed to any single cause, of course, but the Antonine Plague certainly played its part, weakening the demographic and economic foundations upon which the empire rested. And through it all, the trade routes remained, diminished perhaps but never entirely abandoned, still carrying their silks and spices and, inevitably, their diseases. Several centuries later, another great pestilence emerged to travel these same pathways, and this one we call the Plague of Justinian, named for the Byzantine emperor who ruled from Constantinople during those years and who himself contracted the disease but survived. This plague arrived in 541 CE, reaching the imperial capital in 542 CE, and its origins appear to lie somewhere to the east, either in Central Asia along the traditional Silk Road routes or possibly in East Africa, where trade networks connected to the Indian Ocean maritime routes that served as a southern branch of the great trading system. Modern genetic analysis of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for bubonic plague, suggests that the strain involved in the plague of Justinian had been circulating in Central Asian rodent populations for centuries before it made its devastating leap into human populations. The death toll of the plague of Justinian was even more catastrophic than that of the Antonine plague, with estimates ranging from 25 million to 50 million deaths across the Mediterranean world and beyond, though such numbers are necessarily imprecise given the fragmentary nature of ancient demographic records. The Byzantine historian Procopius described bodies piled in the streets of Constantinople, overwhelming the capacity of the living to bury them, and similar scenes played out in cities across the empire and beyond its borders. The plague returned in waves over the following 2 centuries, recurring periodically as new generations lost their immunity and as the disease found fresh populations to infect. And again, we see the paradox of connectivity at work, for it was the very success of Byzantine trade, the very efficiency with which goods moved from east to west, that enabled the disease to spread so rapidly and so far. Now we must allow ourselves a brief digression into the realm of modern science, for the evidence that confirms these ancient patterns of disease transmission comes not only from historical texts, but also from the patient work of archaeologists and geneticists who have examined burial sites along the ancient trade routes. At sites scattered across Central Asia, in the regions that once served as the heart of the Silk Road network, researchers have extracted and sequenced ancient DNA from human remains, and in some of these remains they have found traces of Yersinia pestis, the plague bacterium, preserved across the centuries in dental pulp and bone. These molecular fingerprints allow scientists to reconstruct the family tree of plague strains, to trace how different lineages diverged and spread, and to confirm what historians had long suspected, that the trade routes were indeed corridors of disease transmission, highways along which pathogens traveled in the bodies of merchants and pilgrims and soldiers and all the other human travelers who moved between East and West. But it is the Black Death of the 14th century that remains perhaps the most devastating example of disease spreading along the Silk Road. And here the evidence is both historical and archaeological, textual and genetic, painting a picture of catastrophe on a scale difficult to comprehend. The Black Death, which swept across Europe beginning in 1347 CE and killed somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the European population over the following years, appears to have originated in Central Asia, in the high grasslands where marmots and other burrowing rodents maintained reservoirs of Yersinia pestis in their populations. These rodents had lived with the plague bacterium for countless generations, developing some degree of resistance, but when the disease jumped to human populations, it found hosts with no such evolutionary preparation. The precise mechanism by which the plague spread from its Central Asian origins into the wider world remains a subject of scholarly discussion, but the Mongol Empire, which had unified much of Eurasia under a single political authority during the 13th century, certainly played a role. Mongol armies moved across vast distances, accompanied by their horses and their supply trains and, inevitably, by the rodents that lived among their stores of grain and fodder. The Pax Mongolica, that period of relative peace and open trade that the Mongol conquests made possible, had revitalized the Silk Road trade routes after centuries of fragmentation, but it also created conditions ideal for the spread of disease. What the Mongols called the Yam, their system of relay stations and postal routes that spanned their empire, was also a network along which plague could travel at unprecedented speed. One episode from this period has become particularly famous, though historians continue to debate its precise details and significance. In 1346 CE, a Mongol army besieged the port city of Kaffa on the Crimean Peninsula, a trading colony controlled by the Republic of Genoa that served as a crucial link between the overland trade routes and the Mediterranean shipping networks. According to the account of a Piacenza notary named Gabriele de Mussi, the Mongol army was struck by plague during the siege, and in an act that may represent one of history's earliest documented instances of biological warfare, the Mongol commander ordered the bodies of plague victims to be loaded onto catapults and hurled over the city walls into the Genoa settlement. Whether this actually occurred as described, or whether the plague would have entered Kaffa regardless through the normal channels of flea-infested rats moving through siege lines, we cannot say with certainty. What we know is that the plague did reach Kaffa, and that Genoa's ships fleeing the stricken city carried the disease westward across the Black Sea and into the Mediterranean. In October of 1347 CE, Genoa's trading ships arrived at the Sicilian port of Messina, and the sailors on board were already dying of the plague, their bodies covered with the dark swellings that gave the Black Death its name. The rats that lived aboard these ships, and the fleas that lived upon those rats, carried the plague ashore, and from Sicily it spread with terrifying speed across Italy and then across all of Europe. Within 5 years, the population of the continent had been reduced by somewhere between 75 and 200 million people, depending on which estimates one accepts, and the social, economic, and psychological effects of this catastrophe would shape European history for centuries to come. Smallpox, too, traveled the Silk Road routes, though its history is more difficult to trace because the disease was already present in many populations along the route by the time reliable historical records begin. We know that smallpox was endemic in India and China from ancient times, and that it spread westward along the trade routes into the Middle East and the Mediterranean. The disease left its mark on Egyptian mummies and on the historical record in countless ways, though distinguishing smallpox from other pustular diseases in ancient texts is not always straightforward. What we can say with confidence is that the patterns of human movement along the Silk Road would have facilitated the spread of smallpox just as they facilitated the spread of other diseases, and that populations encountering the virus for the first time would have suffered terribly. The cumulative effect of these disease episodes on the history of the Silk Road itself was profound, though it unfolded slowly, across generations, in ways that contemporaries may not have fully recognized. Population losses meant fewer farmers to work the land, fewer craftsmen to produce goods for trade, fewer consumers to purchase those goods when they arrived from distant lands. Certain route segments fell into disuse as the populations along them declined, and the infrastructure of trade, the caravanserais and the wells and the bridges, fell into disrepair without people to maintain them. New patterns of trade emerged, sometimes following different routes, sometimes relying more heavily on maritime connections that bypassed the overland roads altogether. The very success of the Silk Road as a system of human connection contained within it the seeds of periodic catastrophe, for every connection was also a potential pathway for disease. And so we come to rest on this paradox of connectivity, which may serve as a final thought to carry with you into sleep. The same impulses that drove human beings to trade and travel, to exchange goods and ideas across vast distances, also created the conditions for pandemic disease to spread. Prosperity and death traveled the same roads, carried by the same caravans, and the merchants who grew wealthy from the silk trade also, unknowingly, transported the pathogens that would one day devastate their cities. It is a sobering reflection, perhaps, but it is also simply the way of human history, which rarely offers us goods without their accompanying costs, or connections without their attendant risks. The Silk Road brought the world closer together, for better and for worse. And in this bringing together we see both the heights of human achievement and the depths of human suffering, intertwined like the threads of a silk brocade, inseparable and eternal. Let your mind drift now, away from these somber centuries and toward the quiet darkness of sleep, knowing that the story will continue whenever you are ready to return to it, patient and unhurried, waiting for you like the caravanserai waits for the weary traveler at the end of a long day's journey. Beneath the shifting dunes of one of the world's most forbidding deserts lie the remains of cities that once hummed with life, their streets busy with merchants, their temples filled with devotees, their homes warmed by families who had no way of knowing that the sands would one day swallow everything they had built. The Taklamakan Desert, which stretches across the Tarim Basin in what is now the Xinjiang region of northwestern China, holds within its vast and largely waterless expanse the buried remnants of a dozen or more settlements that flourished during the height of Silk Road trade, only to be abandoned when the rivers that sustained them changed course or dried up entirely, leaving the inhabitants no choice but to gather what they could carry and walk away from everything else. The very name of this desert, Taklamakan, carries within it a warning, for in the Yugur language it translates roughly to something like place of no return, or perhaps you go in and you do not come out, a name that speaks to the dangers that have always attended any attempt to cross its sands. And yet for centuries the only way to move goods between China and the lands to the west was to skirt the edges of this formidable barrier, following the oases that dotted its northern and southern rims like small green promises in an otherwise tan and unforgiving world. The rediscovery of these lost cities began in earnest in the final years of the 19th century, when a Swedish explorer named Sven Hedin undertook a series of expeditions into the heart of Central Asia, driven by a combination of scientific curiosity and that peculiar restlessness that seemed to afflict so many European adventurers of his era. Hedin's 1895 to 1896 expedition into the Taklamakan very nearly cost him his life, as he and his small party ran desperately short of water while crossing the desert's interior, and several of his companions and pack animals did not survive the ordeal. Yet Hedin pressed on, and in doing so he stumbled upon something remarkable: the sand-covered ruins of cities that had been lost to human knowledge for over 1,000 years, their wooden beams and mud-brick walls preserved by the extreme aridity that had also been their undoing. He found houses half buried in dunes, their roofs collapsed but their contents often surprisingly intact, and he found carved wooden artifacts, fragments of silk, and documents written in scripts that no one had seen for centuries. Hedin's discoveries captured the imagination of scholars and the public alike, and they set off what might be called a rush of archaeological exploration into this remote corner of the world, as expeditions from Sweden, Britain, Germany, France, Russia, and Japan all sought to uncover the secrets that the desert had kept hidden for so long. Among the most haunting of the lost cities is the ancient settlement known to Chinese historians as Lulan, though its inhabitants called it Krarana, a name preserved in the documents they left behind. Lulan sat at the northeastern edge of the desert, near the now largely vanished lake called Lop Nur, and for several centuries it served as a crucial way station on the Silk Road, a place where travelers could rest and resupply before undertaking the crossing of the desert's eastern reaches. The city appears in Chinese records as early as the 2nd century before the Common Era, when it was described as a small but strategically important kingdom that alternately allied with and resisted the expanding Han Dynasty. For hundreds of years Lulan thrived, its prosperity tied to its position along the trade routes and to the waters of the Tarim River that flowed past its fields. But sometime around the 4th century of the Common Era, the city was abandoned, its inhabitants departing so completely that within a few generations no one could say with certainty where it had stood. The reason for this abandonment appears to have been environmental rather than military, for the Tarim River, which depends on snow melt from distant mountains and which has changed course many times throughout its history, shifted away from Lulan, depriving the city of the water it needed to survive. Without water for drinking, for irrigation, for the animals that carried goods along the trade routes, life in Lulan became impossible, and so the people left, taking with them what they could and leaving the rest to be slowly covered by the advancing sands. When archaeologists finally relocated Lulan in the early 20th century, they found not only the ruins of buildings but also the preserved remains of some of its ancient inhabitants. For the same dry conditions that killed the vegetation and drove away the living also mummified the bodies of those who had been buried in the surrounding cemeteries. Among the most famous of these mummies is a woman who has come to be known as the Beauty of Lulan, an individual who died approximately 3,800 years ago and whose remarkably well-preserved features have sparked both wonder and considerable scholarly debate. Her hair, which retains its reddish-brown color, frames a face with pronounced cheekbones and a long nose, features that appear more Caucasian than East Asian, and she was buried wrapped in a woolen garment and accompanied by a basket containing grains of wheat. The Beauty of Lulan and the other mummies discovered in the region have raised fascinating questions about the ethnic composition of the ancient Tarim Basin, suggesting that long before the Silk Road existed as a formal trade network, peoples from the West had already made their way to this remote corner of Central Asia, perhaps following the same mountain passes and oasis routes that later merchants would travel. These mummies remind us that human movement across great distances is not a modern phenomenon but rather something our species has been doing for thousands upon thousands of years, driven by the same mixture of necessity, curiosity, and hope that still moves us today. If Sven Hedin opened the door to the exploration of the Taklamakan's buried cities, it was a Hungarian-born British archaeologist named Aurel Stein who walked most thoroughly through that door, conducting a series of 3 major expeditions between 1900 and 1916 that yielded an astonishing wealth of artifacts and documents. Stein was a methodical and indefatigable explorer, capable of enduring extreme cold and heat, and he combined a scholar's interest in ancient languages and texts with a practical ability to organize and lead large expeditions across difficult terrain. His discoveries are almost too numerous to list, but among the most important were the ruined sites of Naya and Dandanoilik, both located along the southern edge of the Taklamakan. At Naya, Stein found the remains of a town that had been abandoned around the 3rd or 4th century of the Common Era, its wooden houses preserved beneath the sand in such detail that he could trace the outlines of orchards and irrigation channels. More valuable still were the hundreds of wooden tablets he recovered from the site, documents written in Korosti, an ancient script derived from Aramaic that had been used in the northwest of the Indian subcontinent and had traveled along the trade routes to this distant outpost. These tablets, which were used for administrative purposes, contain records of loans, contracts, disputes over property, letters between officials, and all the mundane business of daily life in a small garrison town. They tell us that the residents of Naya worried about grain supplies and water rights, that they sued their neighbors and petitioned their superiors, that they fell into debt and struggled to pay it off, all the same small human concerns that occupy us today, preserved by chance and by the dryness of the desert air. At Dandanoilik, Another sand-buried site. Stein found Buddhist temples decorated with painted murals, their colors still vivid despite the centuries of darkness, and wooden panels carved with images of deities and donors. And at a place called Miron, he discovered frescoes painted in a style that scholars immediately recognized as showing strong Roman influence, with winged angels and naturalistic human figures that would not have looked out of place in a Mediterranean context. These Miron frescoes are a remarkable testament to the artistic exchange that the Silk Road made possible. For here in the middle of Central Asia, painters had adopted techniques and motifs that had traveled thousands of kilometers from their place of origin, blending them with local Buddhist subject matter to create something entirely new. The artist who created these works may have been trained in the Greco-Roman tradition, or may have learned from someone who had been, and his presence in this remote desert town speaks to the cosmopolitan nature of Silk Road society, where ideas and styles moved as freely as goods. But it was at the Buddhist cave complex near Dunhuang, at the eastern edge of the Taklamakan, that Stein made perhaps his most controversial discovery. In 1907, he learned of a hidden chamber that had been accidentally uncovered a few years earlier by a Daoist monk named Wang Yuanlu, who was serving as the self-appointed guardian of the caves. This chamber, which came to be known as the Library Cave, had been sealed around the 11th century and then forgotten, its entrance hidden behind a wall of painted plaster. When Wang broke through the wall, he found a small room packed from floor to ceiling with manuscripts, scrolls, paintings on silk, and printed documents, tens of thousands of items that had been placed there for safekeeping and then left undisturbed for nearly 1,000 years. Stein, through a combination of patience, persuasion, and payment, convinced Wang to allow him access to the cave and eventually to sell him a substantial portion of its contents, some 7,000 complete manuscripts and 6,000 fragmentary texts, along with numerous paintings and other artifacts. These materials, which Stein transported back to London, are now housed in the British Museum and the British Library, where they have provided scholars with an invaluable window into the religious, literary, and commercial life of medieval Central Asia. Among the documents Stein acquired was a printed copy of the Diamond Sutra dated to the year 868 of the Common Era, the oldest dated printed book in the world. The following year, in 1908, a French sinologist named Paul Pelliot arrived at Dunhuang and, with Wang's permission, entered the library cave himself. Pelliot, who possessed an exceptional command of Chinese and several Central Asian languages, spent 3 weeks inside the cramped chamber, working by candlelight to examine every item it contained and selecting what he judged to be the most important and unique documents for purchase. His choices were astute, and the collection he brought back to Paris contained some of the rarest and most significant manuscripts from the cave, including texts in Tibetan, Sanskrit, Sogdian, and other languages that spoke to the diverse religious communities that had existed along the Silk Road. Together, the collections assembled by Stein and Pelliot represent the single most important trove of documents ever recovered from the medieval Silk Road, and they continue to be studied intensively by scholars working to understand the history, religion, and culture of this region. Yet the removal of these treasures has also been a source of deep and enduring controversy. Modern Chinese scholars and officials often describe the activities of Stein, Pelliot, and other foreign archaeologists as a form of cultural looting, arguing that these individuals took advantage of a weak and divided China to spirit away national treasures that rightfully belonged to the Chinese people. There is considerable justice in this view. For the expeditions of the early 20th century operated under agreements that were negotiated with local officials who had neither the authority nor the resources to protect the materials in question, and the explorers themselves sometimes employed methods that would be considered unethical by contemporary archaeological standards. Stein, for his part, believed that he was rescuing these documents from neglect and destruction, and it is true that many items left behind at Dunhuang were subsequently damaged or lost. But this argument rings hollow to those who see in his actions simply another chapter in the long history of Western appropriation of non-Western cultural heritage. The debate over the proper home for these materials continues to this day, with periodic calls for their repatriation that have thus far gone unheeded. Whatever one makes of the ethics of their acquisition, the documents and artifacts recovered from the lost cities of the Taklamakan have immeasurably enriched our understanding of Silk Road history. They have shown us that the trade routes were not merely conduits for luxury goods, but also pathways along which religions, languages, artistic styles, and ideas traveled and mixed. They have revealed the daily lives of ordinary people, the garrison soldiers and government clerks and Buddhist monks who inhabited these oasis towns, their concerns and hopes preserved by accident in the wooden paper they left behind. And they have reminded us that even the most flourishing of human settlements can be undone by forces beyond human control. For it was not war or conquest that killed the cities of the Taklamakan, but rather the slow and implacable work of climate change, the shifting of rivers, the advance of the desert, the gradual drying of the air that made agriculture impossible and trade unprofitable. The sand that swallowed these cities did so slowly, grain by grain, covering what had once been green fields and busy streets until nothing remained above the surface but the occasional protruding beam or crumbling wall, waiting in silence for the explorers who would come centuries later to dig them out and wonder at what they found. And so we come now to Chang'an, the great capital of the Tang Dynasty, a city that rose beside the Wei River in what is today the province of Shaanxi, near the modern city of Lebanon, and it is here that we may rest for a while and consider what it meant, in those distant centuries, for a single city to become the largest gathering of humanity the world had ever known, a place where perhaps 1 million souls, and by some estimates as many as 2 million, lived and worked and traded and prayed, all within walls that stretched for nearly 36 kilometers around the perimeter, enclosing a grid of streets so orderly, so deliberately planned, that visitors from distant lands often remarked upon the strange and almost dreamlike regularity of it all. By the year 750 of the Common Era, Chang'an had become something unprecedented in human history, not merely a capital of empire, though it was certainly that, but a true crossroads of civilization, a place where the languages of a dozen distant peoples could be heard in the marketplaces and along the willow-lined canals, where the religions of Persia and India and the Eastern Mediterranean found temples and congregations, and where the fashions and foods and music of Central Asia mingled so thoroughly with Chinese traditions that it became, for a time, difficult to say where one culture ended and another began. And this mingling, this gentle blending of the foreign and the familiar, is perhaps what made Tang Dynasty Chang'an so remarkable to those who lived there and to those of us who study it now from the comfortable distance of many centuries. The city was divided, as many Tang cities were, into carefully regulated wards, each one surrounded by its own walls and gates that were locked at night according to a curfew enforced by guards who walked the streets after dark. And within this orderly arrangement there were two great markets, the Eastern Market and the Western Market. And it is the Western Market that concerns us most in this particular telling, for it was there, in that bustling quarter of the city, that the Silk Road quite literally came to rest, that camels laden with goods from Samarkand and Bukhara and more distant places still would finally complete their journeys of many months, and that merchants from Persia, from Arabia, from the kingdoms of India, from the Korean peninsula, and from the islands of Japan would gather to buy and sell and exchange not only goods but also ideas, recipes, songs, and stories. The Western market covered an area of roughly 1 square kilometer, which is to say about 100 hectares, and it contained, according to various records from the period, more than 3,000 shops and stalls, arranged along streets that were designated for particular trades, so that one might walk along the street of the silk merchants and then turn onto the street of the goldsmiths and then find oneself among the sellers of spices and incense. And all of this commerce took place under the watchful eye of market officials who regulated weights and measures and collected the taxes that helped to fund the Tang imperial government. And though this may sound rather bureaucratic and perhaps even tedious, it was precisely this orderly regulation that made long-distance trade possible. For merchants traveling thousands of kilometers needed to know that their contracts would be honored and their goods protected by laws that applied equally to native and foreigner alike. Among the most visible signs of Chang'an's cosmopolitan character were the changes in fashion and personal style that swept through the city's population during the height of Tang prosperity. For the people of Chang'an, and particularly the women of the aristocratic and wealthy merchant classes, developed what contemporary observers sometimes described with a mixture of fascination and mild disapproval as a passion for foreign things. And this passion expressed itself in clothing that borrowed heavily from Persian and Central Asian styles, with narrower sleeves than traditional Chinese garments, and lapels that crossed the body in the manner of robes worn on the steppes, and fabrics that featured patterns and motifs drawn from Sogdian and Sasanian artistic traditions. And these fashions were not merely worn in private but were depicted in the pottery figurines and painted scrolls of the period, so that we can still see today, in museums around the world, images of Tang women wearing these hybrid styles. The hairstyles of the period also reflected this openness to outside influence, with women of fashion sometimes arranging their hair in elaborate configurations that drew upon Central Asian traditions, piling their dark locks high upon their heads and adorning them with gold and silver ornaments, with flowers both real and artificial, and with combs and pins that were themselves often the work of foreign craftsmen. And men too were not immune to these trends, for the sport of polo, which had originated in Persia and spread eastward along the Silk Road, became tremendously popular among the Tang aristocracy, so much so that emperors themselves were known to participate, and the clothing and equipment associated with polo, the leather boots and the riding trousers and the mallets carved from precious wood, became marks of sophistication and worldly awareness. It was in this atmosphere of cultural mingling that the Hu restaurants flourished, establishments run by and for the foreign communities of Chang'an that served Central Asian cuisine to customers who were often themselves Chinese, curious to taste the foods of distant lands. And these restaurants offered dishes featuring lamb and mutton, which were less common in traditional Chinese cooking, prepared with cumin and other spices that had traveled the Silk Road alongside the merchants who sold them, and flatbreads baked in the manner of the Western regions, and grape wine rather than the rice wine or millet ale that Chinese drinkers had long preferred. And the popularity of these foreign foods became so great that it was not unusual for wealthy Chinese families to employ Central Asian cooks in their own households, a practice that speaks to the genuine integration of foreign communities into the daily life of the Tang capital. It was from this same city, in the year 629 of the Common Era, that a Buddhist monk named Xuanzang set out on what would become one of the most celebrated journeys in all of human history, a pilgrimage to India in search of authentic Buddhist scriptures and teachings that he believed had been corrupted or incompletely transmitted in their passage from the subcontinent to China. And this journey, which was undertaken without official permission and which required Xuanzang to evade border guards and survive the terrors of the desert, lasted for 17 years, during which time the monk traveled through Central Asia and across the mountain passes into the Indian subcontinent, visiting monasteries and universities and sacred sites, collecting manuscripts and relics, and conversing with scholars and kings. And when he finally returned to Chang'an in the year 645, he was greeted as a hero by the Emperor Taizong himself, who had once sent soldiers to arrest him for leaving the country without authorization, but who now recognized the immense value of what Xuanzang had accomplished. The scriptures and relics that Xuanzang brought back to Chang'an were housed in a pagoda specially constructed for the purpose, and the monk spent the remaining years of his life translating Sanskrit texts into Chinese, a labor that produced some of the most important Buddhist literature in the Chinese language. And his account of his travels, dictated to a disciple, became a foundational text for Chinese understanding of India and Central Asia. But perhaps even more enduring than these scholarly achievements was the legend that grew up around Xuanzang's journey, a legend that would eventually inspire, many centuries later, the great novel known in English as Journey to the West. A fantastical tale of a monk traveling to India accompanied by a magical monkey and a pig monster and a river demon. And though this novel bears little resemblance to historical fact, it nonetheless preserves, in its own exuberant way, the memory of that remarkable pilgrimage and of the Tang Dynasty world that made it possible. The court of Emperor Xuanzong, who ruled from 712 to 756, represented in many ways the peak of Tang cosmopolitanism and cultural achievement, and it was at this court that one could find musicians from Kucha performing on instruments unknown in China a century earlier, and dancers from Tashkent and Samarkand executing the rapid spinning movements that Chinese audiences found so entrancing, and poets composing verses that would be remembered and recited for more than 1,000 years. And at the center of this brilliant court was the emperor's beloved consort Yang Guifei, a woman of legendary beauty whose influence over Xuanzong became a subject of both admiration and concern among the officials and historians of the period. And it was through Yang Guifei that a general of Sogdian and Turkic ancestry named An Lushan came to prominence, for he became her adopted son in a ceremony that was perhaps partly jest and partly serious political maneuvering, and he charmed the emperor and accumulated military power in the northeastern regions of the empire. And the relationship between these three figures, the aging emperor and the beautiful consort and the ambitious general, would ultimately determine the fate of the dynasty itself. The foreign entertainers of Chang'an, known collectively as the Abeogia, were particularly celebrated during this period, and they performed not only at court but also in the entertainment quarters of the city, where wealthy merchants and officials gathered to drink and listen to music and watch dancers perform. And these performers came from across Central Asia and beyond, bringing with them artistic traditions that had developed in the courts and caravanserais of the western regions. And their presence in Chang'an was both a cause and a consequence of the Silk Road trade, for they followed the same routes as the merchants and they depended upon the same networks of patronage and protection. And the music they played and the dances they performed gradually influenced Chinese artistic traditions, so that instruments like the pipa, a type of lute, though known in China for centuries, took on new playing styles and new musical modes that reflected Central Asian practice. Among the foreign visitors who left detailed accounts of Tang China was a Japanese monk named Enin, who arrived in the year 838 and remained for nearly a decade, traveling throughout the country and keeping a diary that has survived to the present day. And this diary, which records Enin's observations of Buddhist monasteries and imperial ceremonies and everyday life, provides us with an invaluable glimpse of 9th century China as seen through the eyes of an outsider. And what Enin saw was a society in which foreign religions had established deep roots. For in addition to the Buddhist temples that were his primary concern, he noted the presence of Nestorian Christian churches, known in Chinese records as temples of the luminous religion, and Manichaean establishments whose followers practiced a faith that blended elements of Christianity and Zoroastrianism and Buddhism into a distinctive synthesis. And Zoroastrian fire temples where Persian refugees from the Arab conquest of their homeland continued to practice the ancient religion of their ancestors. And all of these foreign faiths had received official recognition from the Tang government, which generally pursued a policy of religious tolerance so long as foreign communities paid their taxes and caused no disturbance to public order. The bureaucracy of the Tang Empire itself was open to foreign participation in ways that might seem surprising, for officials from the Korean kingdoms of Silla and Beech served in the Tang government after studying for and passing the imperial examinations, and Persian nobles who had fled the Arab conquest found positions at court and in the military, and Sogdian merchants became so integral to the administration of trade that their language and their counting methods influenced Chinese commercial practice for generations. And this openness was supported by the economic system known as the equal field system, under which the state distributed agricultural land to peasant households and collected taxes in grain and cloth. And this system, though it had many flaws and would eventually break down under the pressure of population growth and aristocratic land accumulation, provided during its period of effective operation a stable foundation for the prosperity that made Silk Road trade so profitable and so attractive to merchants from distant lands. But this world of cosmopolitan splendor and cultural exchange could not last forever, and in the year 755 the general An Lushan, who had accumulated vast military forces in the northeast, rose in rebellion against the emperor who had trusted him, and his armies swept southward toward Chang'an with a speed and ferocity that caught the imperial court entirely unprepared. And Emperor Xuanzong fled the capital with Yang Guifei and a small retinue of loyal soldiers. But along the road to exile his guards mutinied and demanded the death of the consort whom they blamed for the empire's troubles. And Xuanzong, faced with the choice between his beloved and his own survival, consented, and Yang Guifei was strangled with a silken cord by the side of the road. And this tragedy, which has inspired poets and dramatists for more than a millennium, marked the end of an era. For though the rebellion was eventually suppressed after 8 years of devastating warfare, Chang'an was never quite the same, and the Tang Dynasty, though it would continue for another century and a half, had begun its long decline. The city that had welcomed the world, that had dressed in Persian fashions and eaten Central Asian food and listened to Sogdian music and debated Indian philosophy, gradually turned inward, and foreign religions came under suspicion, and foreign communities found their position less secure than it had been in the golden years of Xuanzong's reign, and the Silk Road trade continued but on a diminished scale. For the routes through Central Asia had become more dangerous and the Tang government had less ability to protect the merchants who traveled them. And yet the memory of what Chang'an had been, of that brief moment when the largest city in the world spoke every language and worshipped every god and welcomed every traveler who came in peace, that memory endured, preserved in poems and paintings and the pages of old chronicles, waiting to be discovered by us, who live so many centuries later, and who find in that distant cosmopolitanism something that feels strangely familiar, as though the world has always been smaller than we imagined, as though people have always been curious about their neighbors, no matter how far away those neighbors might live. And so we come now to a rather remarkable period in the long history of the Silk Road. A time when the ancient trade routes experienced something quite unprecedented, which was the unification of nearly the entire network under single political authority. And this era has come to be known by historians as the Pax Mongolica, meaning the Mongol peace, though the events that brought it about were anything but peaceful, as we shall see in the gentle unfolding of this chapter. In the year 1206, on the high steppes of Mongolia, a man who had been born with the name Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan, which means something like universal ruler or oceanic ruler depending on how one interprets the Old Turkic and Mongolian languages. And this proclamation marked the beginning of one of the most significant series of military campaigns in all of human history, campaigns that would, by the time of his death in 1227, create an empire stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea, encompassing territories that had for centuries been divided among countless competing powers and kingdoms. The Mongol conquests were, it must be said, devastating for many of the cities and peoples who found themselves in the path of the advancing horsemen, and chronicles from the period describe the destruction of ancient centers of learning and commerce, the disruption of agricultural systems, and the displacement of populations across vast distances. And yet, once the initial violence had subsided and Mongol administration was established, something rather interesting began to happen along the old trade routes, which was that merchants and travelers found they could move with a freedom and safety that had not been known for many centuries, if indeed it had ever been known at all. The reason for this transformation was relatively straightforward in principle, even if its execution required enormous administrative effort. And it was simply that where previously a merchant traveling from China to the Mediterranean would need to pass through perhaps a dozen or more different political jurisdictions, each with its own taxes and tariffs and local dangers and regional conflicts, now that same merchant might travel nearly the entire distance within the borders of a single empire, subject to a single set of laws, protected by a single military authority. And this fundamental change in the political geography of Eurasia had profound effects on the movement of goods, ideas, technologies, and people. One of the most impressive achievements of the Mongol administration, and one that directly facilitated both trade and governance across these enormous distances, was the establishment of what was called the Yam system, which was an elaborate network of postal relay stations positioned at intervals of roughly 25 to 30 miles across the entire extent of the empire. And at each of these stations fresh horses were kept ready along with supplies and accommodations, so that official messengers carrying imperial communications could travel at speeds that seemed almost miraculous to contemporary observers, covering distances in days that would normally require weeks or months of travel. The Yam system was not available to ordinary merchants, being reserved primarily for official government business, but its existence had beneficial effects that rippled outward to affect all travel along the Silk Road, because the stations themselves became points of rest and resupply. The roads connecting them were maintained and patrolled, and the regular passage of official messengers meant that news of bandits or other dangers could be communicated and addressed with previously impossible speed. And furthermore, the Mongol Khans sometimes issued documents called paisas, which were tablets of authority that granted the bearer access to the Yam system and its resources, and these documents were occasionally given to favored merchants or diplomatic envoys. It was with such documents of safe passage that one of the most famous European travelers of the medieval period made his way across Asia, and this was of course Marco Polo, whose journey began in 1271 when he departed Venice at approximately 17 years of age, traveling with his father Niccolo and his uncle Maffeo. who had already made one journey to the Mongol court and were now returning with young Marco in their company. And the three Venetians would not see their home city again for approximately 24 years, during which time they traveled to the court of Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, who had become Great Khan and had also established himself as Emperor of China, founding what is known as the Han Dynasty. According to the account that Marco Polo later dictated, he entered into the service of Kublai Khan and was employed on various administrative and diplomatic missions across the vast Mongol domains, traveling to provinces of China, to Burma, and to other regions, observing the customs of the peoples he encountered, the systems of governance, the natural resources, the methods of manufacture, and countless other details both significant and seemingly trivial. And when he eventually returned to Venice and was later imprisoned during a conflict with Genoa, he dictated his recollections to a fellow prisoner named Rustic Hello of Pisa, who wrote them down in a book that came to be known by various titles, including The Description of the World and The Travels of Marco Polo. The authenticity and accuracy of Marco Polo's account has been debated by scholars for many centuries, with some arguing that certain details suggest he could not have actually visited all the places he claims, noting for example that he does not mention the Great Wall of China, nor the practice of foot binding, nor the drinking of tea, nor the Chinese writing system. And these omissions have led some to suggest that perhaps Marco Polo only traveled as far as the western reaches of the Mongol Empire and gathered the rest of his information from Persian merchants and other second-hand sources, while defenders of the account point to the many accurate details it does contain, details about Mongol customs and Chinese administrative practices that would have been difficult to fabricate. And the debate continues in academic circles to this day. Though what is certain is that regardless of precisely where Marco Polo himself traveled, his account provides valuable information about the Eurasian world of the 13th century as it was understood by those who participated in its trade networks. Marco Polo was not, however, the only European to make the long journey to the Mongol court during this period. And indeed there were others who preceded him, including a Franciscan friar named William of Rubruck, who set out in 1253 on a mission sent by King Louis IX of France, the king who would later be canonized as Saint Louis, and William's journey took him across the steppes to the court of Monkey Khan, who was the Great Khan at that time and who was another grandson of Genghis Khan. And William remained at the Mongol court for several months before making the return journey, arriving back in the eastern Mediterranean in 1255, and he wrote a detailed account of his travels that many historians consider to be more reliable and ethnographically valuable than the later account of Marco Polo, though it never achieved the same popular fame. What William of Rubruck found at the Mongol court, and what surprised many European observers, was the remarkable religious diversity that existed within the Mongol ruling circles. For the Mongols themselves practiced a form of shamanism involving reverence for the eternal blue sky and various natural spirits, but they generally adopted a policy of religious tolerance toward their subjects and even toward members of their own families who chose to follow other faiths. And at the court, William encountered not only Buddhists and Muslims but also Christians of the Nestorian tradition. And indeed, Christianity had made significant inroads among certain Mongol tribes and among the ruling family itself. One of the most influential Christian figures in the Mongol court was a woman named Sorgatani Beki, who was the widow of Tului, the youngest son of Genghis Khan, and who was the mother of 4 sons who would all rise to positions of enormous power, including Monkey Khan and Kublai Khan. And Sorgatani herself was a Nestorian Christian who was renowned for her intelligence and political acumen. And though she apparently did not attempt to convert her sons, Her influence meant that Christianity was viewed favorably in certain Mongol circles, and Nestorian Christians occupied important positions as administrators, physicians, and advisors throughout the empire. The religious openness of the Mongol court led to various diplomatic missions from the Christian West, and one of the most remarkable of these was undertaken not by a European traveling eastward but by an Eastern Christian traveling westward, and this was a man named Rabban Bar Sauma, who was born in or near Beijing in the early 13th century and who was a Nestorian Christian clergyman of Uighur or possibly Ongid ancestry. And in 1275 he set out on a pilgrimage toward Jerusalem together with a younger companion named Rabban Marcos, and their journey took them westward along the Silk Road through Central Asia to Persia, where they found that the Mongol rulers of the Ilkhanate were interested in forming an alliance with European Christian powers against their common enemies. And so Rabban Bar Sauma was sent as a diplomatic envoy to Europe, where he met with the Byzantine Emperor in Constantinople, with King Philip IV of France in Paris, with King Edward I of England in Gascony, and with Pope Nicholas IV in Rome in 1287, and his journey has sometimes been called a reverse Marco Polo, as he travelled from east to west rather than from west to east. And his account of Europe as seen through Eastern eyes provides a fascinating complement to the European accounts of Asia from the same period. The establishment of Christian missions in China itself was accomplished by another figure from this era, a Franciscan friar named Giovanni di Montecorvino, who arrived in Beijing in 1294 and who, over the following decades, built churches, translated religious texts into the local languages, and established a small but functioning Catholic community that would persist until the fall of the Yuan dynasty, and his letters back to Rome provide valuable glimpses into the religious and cultural life of Mongol China. The unification of the Silk Road under Mongol authority also facilitated the spread of various technologies and administrative innovations, and one of the most significant of these was paper money, which the Chinese had been using in various forms for several centuries, and which the Mongol administration formalized and extended throughout their domains, introducing a currency called chow, which was printed on mulberry bark paper and which was backed by the authority of the state and by reserves of silk and precious metals. And as the Mongol Empire expanded westward, this system of paper currency was introduced into Persia and other regions where it had not previously been known. And though its reception was mixed and it eventually contributed to economic problems due to overprinting and inflation, it represented a remarkable transfer of financial technology across the breadth of Eurasia. The safety of travel during the Pax Mongolica has sometimes been exaggerated in later accounts, but there is no doubt that it represented a significant improvement over what had come before, and various sources from the period make claims that illustrate the ideal if not always the reality, with some suggesting that a young woman carrying a nugget of gold could walk alone from one end of the empire to the other without being molested, which was an image meant to convey the perfect enforcement of Mongol law and the complete suppression of banditry along the trade routes. And while this was surely an idealized picture, the volume of trade and travel that occurred during this period suggests that conditions were indeed remarkably favorable compared to other eras. But like all periods in history, the Pax Mongolica did not last forever, and by the middle of the 14th century, several factors were combining to bring it to an end, including the gradual fragmentation of the Mongol Empire into separate and sometimes competing khanates, the devastating effects of the Black Death which swept across Eurasia beginning in the 1340s and which killed perhaps a third of the population in many regions, disrupting trade networks and weakening political structures, and the fall of the Yuan dynasty in China in 1368 when the native Chinese Ming dynasty came to power and adopted a more inward-looking policy that reduced engagement with the overland trade routes, And with these changes, the remarkable era of unified Silk Road travel came to a close, and the routes would never again see quite the same degree of integration and safety, though trade would of course continue in various forms and through various channels, as it always does, finding new ways and new paths as the political geography of Eurasia continued its endless gradual transformation. And so we come now to a quieter passage in our story, a passage concerned not with the bustle of caravans arriving at city gates, nor with the clink of coins changing hands in covered bazaars, but rather with the slow and almost imperceptible shifting of the world's attention away from the land and toward the sea, a process that took many decades to unfold and which, in its gradual way, drew the life from those ancient overland routes like water seeping slowly from a cracked vessel, leaving behind only the memory of what had once been. To understand this transition, we must first travel to the harbors of Ming Dynasty China in the early 15th century, where there occurred one of the most remarkable maritime enterprises in all of human history, an enterprise so vast in its scale and so ambitious in its reach that it briefly made the Chinese emperor the most powerful naval figure the world had ever known, and yet which was destined to be abandoned so completely that the very records of its achievement would be deliberately destroyed, as if the empire wished to forget that it had ever looked outward across the waters at all. The admiral who commanded this extraordinary endeavor was named Zheng He, and he was a most unusual figure to find at the head of a great navy, for he had been born into a Muslim family in the landlocked province of Yunnan, captured as a boy during the Ming conquest of that region, and raised thereafter as a court eunuch in the service of the prince who would eventually become the Yongle emperor. Yet despite these humble and painful beginnings, or perhaps in some way because of them, Zheng He rose to become the most trusted servant of his imperial master, and when the emperor decided that China should project its power and prestige across the seas of Asia and beyond, it was Zheng He whom he chose to lead the treasure fleets that would carry this message to the far corners of the maritime world. Between the years 1405 and 1433, Zheng He commanded 7 great voyages, each one departing from the ports of southern China with a fleet of such enormous size that contemporary European navies would have seemed like clusters of fishing boats by comparison. The treasure fleet, as it was called, consisted of more than 300 vessels on its largest expeditions, including the famous treasure ships themselves, which were said to measure over 400 feet in length and to carry crews of several hundred sailors each, along with smaller supply ships, water tankers, horse transports, and patrol boats, all sailing together in a formation that must have been visible for miles across the open water, a floating city moving steadily across the waves. These fleets visited ports throughout Southeast Asia, calling at Java and Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula, before continuing westward to Ceylon and the various kingdoms of the Indian subcontinent, and then pressing onward still to the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea and finally to the eastern coast of Africa, where Chinese sailors walked upon shores that no one from their empire had ever seen before, trading porcelain and silk for ivory and exotic animals and the tribute that demonstrated, at least in the eyes of the Chinese court, the natural supremacy of the Middle Kingdom over all the peoples of the earth. And yet, almost as soon as these voyages reached their greatest extent, the political winds in China shifted, and the faction at court that had supported maritime expansion found itself overwhelmed by Confucian officials who believed that such adventures were wasteful and improper, that a civilized empire should look inward to its agriculture and its scholarship rather than outward to the barbarous regions beyond its borders. The Yongle emperor died in 1424, and though Zheng He lived long enough to command one final voyage under the emperor's successor, the treasure fleets never sailed again after 1433, and the great shipyards that had built them were allowed to fall into disrepair. What happened next is one of the more melancholy episodes in the history of human exploration. The subsequent Ming emperors implemented a policy known as the Haijin, a series of maritime prohibitions that restricted and eventually banned private sea trade, that forbade the construction of ocean-going vessels, and that in some versions of the policy made it a crime for Chinese subjects to travel abroad at all. The great ships of the treasure fleet were left to rot in their harbors, and most remarkably of all, the official records of Zheng his voyages were deliberately destroyed or hidden away, so thoroughly suppressed that later generations of Chinese would scarcely know that their ancestors had once commanded the greatest navy in the world. The reasons for this withdrawal have been debated by historians for centuries, and they include the enormous expense of maintaining such fleets, the philosophical objections of the Confucian bureaucracy, the military pressures on China's northern borders that demanded attention and resources, and perhaps a simple failure of imperial imagination, an inability to see what purpose might be served by continuing to visit distant lands that offered no serious military threat and whose trade goods could, after all, still reach China through other means. Whatever the causes, the effect was clear enough, and by the time European ships began to appear in Asian waters later in the century, China had entirely abandoned its brief experiment with maritime supremacy, leaving the seas open to whoever might choose to sail upon them. That someone would soon appear, sailing not from the east but from the far west, around the southern tip of Africa by a route that no European vessel had ever successfully completed before. In the year 1498, a Portuguese navigator named Vasco da Gama reached the coast of India after a voyage of more than 10 months, having departed from Lisbon and sailed south along the African coast, around the Cape of Good Hope, and then northeast across the Indian Ocean to the port of Calicut, where he found spices and textiles and precious stones in such abundance that the potential profits made the dangers of the journey seem almost trivial by comparison. This voyage, and the many that followed in its wake, represented the moment when the ancient overland routes began their final decline, for da Gama had discovered what merchants had long suspected, that a ship could carry more cargo more cheaply than any caravan of camels, and that the sea routes, though longer in absolute distance, were faster and more efficient than the laborious land crossings that had sustained the Silk Road for nearly 2,000 years. The Portuguese, having found their way to India, moved with remarkable speed to establish permanent footholds throughout the maritime world. In 1510 they captured Goa on the western coast of India, transforming it into the capital of their Eastern Empire and the headquarters from which they would dominate the Indian Ocean trade for the next century. In 1511 they seized Malacca on the Malay Peninsula, gaining control of the narrow strait through which all shipping between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea was forced to pass, a choke point of such strategic importance that whoever held it could effectively tax the entire trade of Eastern Asia. These developments were part of a larger transformation in the patterns of world trade, a transformation that had been set in motion several decades earlier by an event that occurred not at sea but on land, in the ancient city of Constantinople, where in the year 1453 the last remnants of the Roman Empire finally fell to the Ottoman Turks under Sultan Mehmed II. The fall of Constantinople was not in itself the death of the Silk Road, for overland trade had continued throughout the centuries of Byzantine decline, and the Ottoman Empire that replaced it was perfectly willing to profit from the commerce that passed through its territories. But the conquest did disrupt the established patterns of trade, and more importantly, It placed the entire eastern Mediterranean under the control of a single Islamic power whose relationship with the Christian kingdoms of Western Europe was characterized more by hostility than by commercial cooperation. The Italian city-states of Venice and Genoa, which had grown wealthy precisely by serving as intermediaries between the eastern trade routes and the markets of Europe, found their privileged positions increasingly difficult to maintain. The Ottomans were not inclined to grant them the same favorable terms they had enjoyed under the Byzantines, and the profits that had once flowed so reliably through Italian counting houses began to diminish as the sultans extracted ever larger shares for themselves. It was this squeeze on the traditional intermediaries that provided much of the motivation for the great age of European exploration. For the Portuguese and Spanish kings who sponsored voyages into unknown waters were not moved purely by curiosity or by religious zeal, though both of those factors played their parts. They were moved also by the very practical desire to find new routes to the Spice Islands and the silk markets of Asia, routes that would bypass the Ottoman middlemen and the Italian merchants who had grown rich by controlling access to the luxuries of the East. The irony of this search for eastern routes is well known to every schoolchild, for it was precisely this desire to reach Asia by sailing west that led Christopher Columbus to stumble upon the Americas in 1492, mistaking the islands of the Caribbean for the outskirts of Japan and thus inaugurating an entirely unintended chapter in human history. Columbus died believing that he had found a Western approach to the Indies, never suspecting that he had instead encountered continents whose existence no European had imagined, and whose conquest and exploitation would eventually overshadow even the ancient trade with Asia that had prompted his voyage in the first place. Meanwhile, back along the old land routes, the oasis cities that had thrived for so many centuries began their slow and melancholy decline. The merchants still came, but in smaller numbers with each passing decade, and the caravans that had once stretched for miles across the desert dwindled to modest trains carrying only local goods between neighboring towns. The great markets of Kasha and Bukhara grew quieter, the caravanserais fell into disrepair, and the populations of these once thriving centers gradually diminished as the young people left in search of opportunities elsewhere, and the old people remained behind to tend the gardens and the graves. There was, in the midst of this decline, one final flowering of culture and learning along the ancient routes, a brief renaissance that occurred in the city of Samarkand under the rule of Ulf Beg, the grandson of the great conqueror Timur and himself a scholar of remarkable gifts. Ulf Beg was not primarily interested in warfare or commerce, though he understood the necessity of both. His true passion was astronomy, and in the 1420s he constructed in Samarkand an observatory of unprecedented size and precision, equipped with instruments so large and so carefully calibrated that his measurements of the heavens remained the most accurate in the world for nearly 200 years. The observatory itself was a massive structure, built into the side of a hill to provide stability, containing a great marble sextant with a radius of over 40 meters, along which the positions of the stars could be measured with an accuracy of mere seconds of arc. Ulf Beg gathered around him the finest mathematicians and astronomers of the Islamic world, and together they produced star catalogues and astronomical tables that were eagerly copied and translated by scholars from India to Europe. But this Timurid glory was destined to be brief, for Ulf Beg was murdered in 1449 by his own son, and the political chaos that followed dispersed the scholars he had assembled and brought an end to the great project of observation and calculation that had occupied the final decades of his life. The observatory fell into ruin, and Samarkand itself continued its gradual decline, still beautiful in its architecture and still famous for its history, but no longer the vital crossroads it had been in centuries past. The Dutch and the English, watching the success of Portuguese enterprise in Asia, were not content to leave the maritime trade entirely in Iberian hands. In 1600, the English established their East India Company, and in 1602 the Dutch founded their own East India Company, both of these organizations representing a new form of commercial enterprise. Joint stock companies that pooled the resources of many investors to finance voyages too expensive for any single merchant to undertake alone, and that brought to the business of Asian trade a systematic, almost industrial efficiency that the old overland caravans could never have matched. These companies built their own ships, maintained their own warehouses and trading posts, negotiated their own treaties with Asian rulers, and eventually commanded their own private armies, becoming in effect small governments unto themselves, answerable to their shareholders rather than to any king or parliament. They transformed the spice trade and the silk trade from romantic adventures into calculated investments, measuring success not in tales of exotic lands but in dividends paid and market shares captured. The economic logic was irresistible. A single large ship could carry more cargo than dozens of camel caravans, and could complete the journey from Asia to Europe in a matter of months rather than the year or more required by the overland routes. The goods arrived in better condition, unspoiled by the dust and handling of countless transfers from camel to warehouse to camel again, and the costs of transport were a fraction of what the land merchants had charged. The Silk Road had served the world well for nearly 2 millennia, but against this new competition it simply could not survive. And so the caravans grew fewer, and the oasis cities grew quieter, and the great routes that had once connected the civilizations of East and West fell slowly into disuse, remembered only in the stories that old merchants told to their grandchildren, of journeys across deserts and mountains, of strange peoples and stranger customs, of fortunes made and lost in the endless dance of trade. The sea had taken over, as perhaps it was always destined to do, and the Silk Road passed from living commerce into history. And so we come now to the movement of ideas, which traveled along those ancient routes just as surely as the silk and the spices did, though ideas weigh nothing at all and require no camels to carry them, only the minds of curious people willing to learn from strangers and to share what they themselves had discovered. And it is this exchange of knowledge and technique that would, over the long centuries, reshape the world in ways that no merchant or emperor could have foreseen when the first caravan set out across the desert sands. Let us begin with paper, that most ordinary of materials, which you perhaps have near you now, or perhaps you have held today without giving it much thought. And yet there was a time when paper did not exist at all, when people wrote on bamboo strips or silk cloth or animal skins, all of which were cumbersome or expensive or both, and the invention of paper changed the very possibility of what humans could record and remember and pass on to those who would come after them. The traditional account tells us that a court official named Cai Lun presented his method for making paper to the Han Emperor in the year 105 of the Common Era, though archaeological evidence suggests that earlier forms of paper existed in China perhaps 2 centuries before Cai Lun refined the process. And what he did was to standardize and improve a technique that involved soaking plant fibers, particularly the inner bark of mulberry trees, along with hemp rags and old fishing nets, in water until the fibers separated and could be spread upon a screen to dry into thin, flexible sheets. And this invention remained a Chinese secret for many centuries, spreading slowly to Korea and Japan but not yet to the lands further west. The crucial moment in paper's westward journey came in the year 751, at a place called Talas, near the borders of what is now Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, where the armies of the Tang dynasty met the forces of the Abbasid Caliphate in a battle that was, in military terms, a relatively minor affair, a skirmish at the edge of two great empires. And yet among the Chinese prisoners taken by the Arab forces were, according to tradition, skilled papermakers, craftsmen who knew the secrets of transforming plant fibers into writing surfaces. And these captured artisans were brought to Samarkand, where they established the first paper mills outside of East Asia, teaching their captors the techniques that had been guarded for so long. From Samarkand, the knowledge of papermaking spread throughout the Islamic world, reaching Baghdad and Damascus and Cairo, and the Arab papermakers improved upon the Chinese methods, developing new techniques and finding new sources of raw materials suited to their own lands. And paper mills arose across North Africa and eventually in the Iberian Peninsula, where Islamic civilization flourished in what is now Spain. And by the 12th century, paper was being manufactured in Christian Europe, first in Italy and then spreading northward, gradually replacing the parchment and vellum that had been used for manuscripts throughout the medieval period. And all of this because of a battle fought on the distant steppes and the craftsmen who were taken from their homes and carried westward along the very routes we have been discussing. Another Chinese invention that would transform the world was gunpowder, and its origins lie not in warfare but in the peaceful, if eccentric, pursuits of Taoist alchemists who spent their lives searching for the elixir of immortality, mixing various substances together in the hope of creating a potion that would grant eternal life. And sometime during the 9th century, these seekers after deathlessness stumbled upon a mixture of saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal that, when ignited, produced a violent and spectacular reaction. And though this discovery did not grant anyone immortality, it would, in time, hasten the deaths of countless thousands and reshape the nature of warfare itself. The Chinese first used gunpowder for fireworks and signals, and then gradually developed military applications, creating fire lances and rockets and eventually primitive firearms and explosive bombs. And knowledge of this remarkable substance began to filter westward along the Silk Road during the Mongol period, when the great Khans ruled an empire stretching from the Pacific to the borders of Europe. And by the 13th century, Arab scientists were writing about gunpowder and its properties, describing the ingredients and proportions needed to create it. And by the 14th century, European armies were deploying cannons and handguns on their battlefields, and the age of gunpowder warfare had begun, an age that would continue for many centuries and would still be with us today, all tracing back to those Taoist alchemists in their mountain retreats, searching for something else entirely. The story of printing is similarly intertwined with the Silk Road, though it takes different forms in East and West, and we should distinguish between woodblock printing, which the Chinese developed and perfected, and movable type printing, which appeared first in China and Korea but found its fullest expression in the workshop of Johannes Gutenberg in 15th century Germany. The oldest dated printed book that survives intact is the Diamond Sutra, a Buddhist text printed in China in the year 868. A scroll nearly 5 meters long composed of 7 panels of text and 1 panel of illustration, all carved in reverse onto wooden blocks and then pressed onto paper with ink. And this single surviving copy, discovered in a sealed cave near Dunhuang on the Silk Road, represents a technology that was already well developed by that time, suggesting that printing had been practiced in China for some years before this particular book was created, and woodblock printing would remain the dominant form in East Asia for many centuries. The Chinese and Koreans also experimented with movable type, using individually carved characters that could be rearranged and reused. with ceramic type appearing in China in the 11th century and metal type in Korea by the 13th. Though the enormous number of characters in Chinese writing made this approach less practical than it would prove to be for alphabetic scripts, and it was in Europe that movable type would have its most dramatic impact. When Gutenberg and his associates developed their system of cast metal type and the printing press in the 1450s, producing the famous 42-line Bible and inaugurating an age of mass literacy that would transform European society and, eventually, the world. Whether Gutenberg knew of Asian printing techniques remains a matter of scholarly debate, and there is no direct evidence that knowledge of Chinese or Korean movable type reached Europe before his invention, though the possibility of some indirect influence traveling along the trade routes cannot be entirely ruled out. And in any case, the parallel development of similar technologies in different parts of the world connected by trade reminds us how ideas can spark across cultures in ways that are sometimes difficult to trace. The magnetic compass is another invention that made its first appearance in China, though its original purpose was not navigation but rather the ancient practice of feng shui, the art of arranging buildings and objects in harmony with the natural forces of the earth. And during the Han Dynasty, Chinese practitioners used lodestones, naturally magnetic pieces of iron ore, mounted on boards to indicate directions. And over the centuries this technology was refined until, by the Song Dynasty, magnetized needles floating in water were being used by Chinese sailors to navigate the open seas. Knowledge of the compass reached the Islamic world and then the Mediterranean by the 12th century, where it revolutionized maritime navigation and made possible the great voyages of exploration that would, in time, connect all the continents of the earth by sea, though by then the Silk Road itself was beginning its long decline, being replaced by oceanic trade routes that could carry goods more cheaply and in greater quantities. And so the compass, a gift from the East, helped bring about the end of the overland trade that had carried it westward in the first place. We should speak also of mathematics, for numbers too traveled the Silk Road, and the numeral system that we use today, including the concept of zero, which makes all modern mathematics and science possible, has its origins in India, where mathematicians developed a place-value decimal system that used a small circle or dot to represent the absence of a quantity in a given position. And this was a profound innovation, allowing calculations that would have been impossibly cumbersome with Roman numerals or other systems. Indian numerals were adopted by Persian and Arab mathematicians, who recognized their usefulness and spread them throughout the Islamic world. And the great scholar Al-Khwarizmi, working in 9th century Baghdad, wrote treatises that introduced these numerals to Arabic-speaking readers and developed the mathematical techniques that we now call algebra, a word derived from the Arabic al-jaba, meaning restoration or completion, and through Islamic Spain and through the trading cities of Italy. These numerals eventually reached Christian Europe, where they were sometimes called Arabic numerals, though more properly they should be called Hindu-Arabic numerals, acknowledging both their origin and their transmission. The very technology that gave the Silk Road its name, the production of silk itself, eventually spread beyond China's borders. Though the Chinese guarded the secret of sericulture, the cultivation of silkworms, for as long as they could, understanding that their monopoly on silk production was a source of great wealth and power, and various legends describe how the secret was finally revealed. One telling of a Chinese princess who hid silkworm eggs in her headdress when she was sent to marry a foreign king, another speaking of monks who concealed the eggs in hollow bamboo canes. And by the 6th century, the Byzantine Empire had established its own silk production, breaking China's monopoly, and silk weaving spread gradually westward, though Chinese silk remained prized for its quality for many centuries more. In the other direction, glassmaking knowledge traveled eastward along the Silk Road, for the Romans and their successors in the eastern Mediterranean had developed sophisticated techniques for producing clear glass and colored glass of remarkable beauty, and Roman glass vessels were highly prized in China, where glass was less developed, and Chinese tombs from the Han Dynasty contain glass objects that chemical analysis has shown to have originated in the Roman world, having traveled thousands of kilometers along the trade routes to reach their final resting places. And over time, some glassmaking techniques filtered into China and other parts of Asia, though glass never achieved the cultural importance there that it held in the Mediterranean world. The exchange of astronomical knowledge represents another form of intellectual trade along the Silk Road. For the Chinese, the Indians, the Persians, and the Greeks had all developed sophisticated systems for observing and predicting the movements of the heavens, and when these traditions met and mingled, particularly in the great centers of learning along the trade routes, new syntheses emerged, and the city of Samarkand became especially renowned as a place where astronomical knowledge from different traditions was combined and refined, most famously under the patronage of the ruler Ulf Beg in the 15th century, who built an enormous observatory and produced star catalogues of remarkable accuracy. Finally, we should remember that living things too moved along the Silk Road, plants that would transform agriculture and diet across continents, and cotton cultivation spread from India both eastward to China and westward to the Mediterranean, and sugarcane followed similar routes, bringing sweetness to lands that had known only honey, and citrus fruits, oranges and lemons and their relatives, traveled westward from Southeast Asia, and grapes and winemaking spread eastward, and rice cultivation extended its range, and wheat varieties were exchanged, and spices of all kinds, pepper and cinnamon and cloves and nutmeg, moved westward from their tropical origins to flavor the cooking of distant peoples who had never seen the trees and vines from which these treasures came. All of these exchanges, of paper and gunpowder and printing and the compass and numerals and silk making and glass making and astronomical knowledge and crops, remind us that the Silk Road was never simply a route for moving goods from one place to another, but was rather a vast network for the transmission of human knowledge and invention, a web of connections along which ideas could travel and combine and transform, creating new possibilities that no single culture could have developed alone. And as we rest now, thinking of those ancient roots, we might reflect on how deeply our modern world has been shaped by the travelers and traders and scholars who carried these innovations across mountains and deserts and seas, bringing the thoughts of one civilization to the minds of another. And so, after many centuries of gradual decline, after the great maritime routes had drawn commerce away from the ancient overland pathways, and after the modern era had brought aeroplanes and container ships and fiber optic cables that seemed to make the old caravan trails entirely obsolete, the Silk Road found itself returning, quite unexpectedly, to the center of global attention, though this time not through the slow accumulation of merchant enterprise and cultural exchange, but through the deliberate and ambitious policy of a single nation that saw in those historical roots a template for something rather new. And it is this development, this curious resurrection of an ancient idea in modern form, that we shall now consider, gently and without hurry, as we trace the outlines of what has become known as the Belt and Road Initiative. The story begins, as these things often do, with a speech, and the speech in question was delivered on a pleasant September day in the year 2013, in the city of Astana, which is the capital of Kazakhstan, a vast country that stretches across the very heartland through which the old Silk Road once passed, And it was there, at Nazarbayev University, that the Chinese president, a man named Xi Jinping, stood before an audience of students and officials and professors and calmly proposed what he called the Silk Road Economic Belt, a grand vision of connectivity and cooperation that would link China to Europe through a network of roads and railways and pipelines and economic partnerships. And though the speech itself was not particularly long or dramatic, it represented the beginning of what would become one of the most ambitious infrastructure programs in human history. A program that would eventually encompass not just overland routes but maritime pathways as well, and would touch the economies and the landscapes of more than 140 countries around the world. The Belt and Road Initiative, as it came to be known, actually consists of two complementary components, and it is worth taking a moment to understand how they differ from one another, even as they work together toward the same general aims. For the first component, the Silk Road Economic Belt concerns itself with overland connections, with railways stretching across the Eurasian continent, with highways winding through mountain passes, with pipelines carrying oil and natural gas from the energy-rich regions of Central Asia, and with economic corridors that link Chinese manufacturing centers to markets in Europe and the Middle East. While the second component, which is called the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road, focuses on the sea routes that connect Chinese ports to Southeast Asia, to South Asia, to East Africa, and eventually through the Suez Canal to the Mediterranean and beyond. And together these two components form a kind of embrace around the Eurasian landmass, reaching out in all directions from China toward markets and resources and strategic positions that the planners in Beijing consider vital to their nation's continued development and prosperity. The scale of investment involved in this initiative has been, by any reasonable measure, quite extraordinary, with estimates suggesting that China has committed or spent well over $1 trillion across the various projects and partnerships that fall under the Belt and Road umbrella, though the exact figures are difficult to determine with precision because the initiative encompasses such a wide variety of undertakings, from massive port developments to modest road improvements, from power plants to telecommunications networks, and because the financing arrangements often involve complex mixtures of loans and grants and equity investments that blur the line between commercial enterprise and state-directed policy. But regardless of the precise accounting, it is clear that the sums involved are enormous, and that they have flowed outward from China to countries on every inhabited continent, touching the lives of hundreds of millions of people who may or may not have heard of the Silk Road Economic Belt but who nonetheless find their daily circumstances shaped by its projects and its presence. Among the most significant of these undertakings is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, a collection of infrastructure projects that stretches from the far western reaches of China, across the formidable Karakoram mountain range, and down through the length of Pakistan to the warm waters of the Arabian Sea. And at the southern terminus of this corridor lies the port of Gwadar, a small fishing town in the Balochistan region that has been transformed, through massive Chinese investment, into a deep-water port capable of handling the largest modern cargo vessels. And from Gwadar, it is said, goods can be shipped to the Middle East and to Africa and to Europe without having to pass through the congested and strategically vulnerable Strait of Malacca, which is the narrow passage between Malaysia and Indonesia through which so much of China's maritime trade currently flows. And so the development of Gwadar represents not merely an economic investment but also a strategic repositioning, a diversification of routes that reduces China's dependence on any single pathway and provides options in the event of disruption or conflict. Though the people of Gwadar themselves, the fishermen and their families who have lived there for generations, have found their lives transformed in ways both welcome and unsettling by the arrival of this massive project on their shores. The overland railways of the Belt and Road Initiative have captured the imagination of many observers, perhaps because they seem to fulfill most directly the historical promise of the ancient Silk Road. And among these railways, the China-Europe Railway Express has received particular attention, connecting the Chinese city of Yiwu, which is a major center of small commodity manufacturing in Zhejiang province, to the Spanish capital of Madrid, a journey of approximately 13,000 kilometers that the trains complete in roughly 18 days, passing through Kazakhstan and Russia and Belarus and Poland and Germany and France before reaching their final destination. And while 18 days may seem a long time in our age of air freight and instant communication, it represents a significant improvement over the 30 or more days that maritime shipping typically requires, and at a cost considerably lower than air transport, so that for certain categories of goods, particularly those of moderate value and moderate urgency, the railway offers an attractive middle option, and the trains themselves have become a kind of symbol of the initiative, their colorful containers bearing the logos of the various companies that operate them, rolling steadily westward across the vast Eurasian steppe much as the camel caravans once plodded along those same general pathways, though of course at considerably greater speed. At the very center of this overland network, on the border between China and Kazakhstan, there has risen a most remarkable facility, a place called Korgo's Gateway, which some have described as the largest dry port in the world. Though what exactly constitutes a dry port and how one measures its size are matters of some definitional complexity, but regardless of such quibbles, Korgo's is certainly an impressive operation, a sprawling complex of railway yards and container terminals and warehouses and customs facilities where goods are transferred between trains of different gauges. For the Chinese railways use a standard gauge of 1,435 mm, while the railways of the former Soviet Union, including those of Kazakhstan, use a broader gauge of 1,520 mm. And so every container that crosses this border must be lifted from one set of wagons and placed upon another, a task that the facilities at Korgo's accomplish with remarkable efficiency. The great gantry cranes moving steadily back and forth, the containers swinging through the air in an endless mechanical ballet that continues day and night. And around this hub of transport there has grown a special economic zone and a new city, rising from the empty grasslands where nomads once drove their flocks, and the whole development represents a kind of bet on the future, a wager that overland trade between China and Europe will continue to grow and that Korgo's will remain at its center. Not all of the projects associated with the Belt and Road Initiative have proceeded smoothly or been received with universal enthusiasm, and it is worth pausing here to consider some of the concerns and criticisms that have been raised. For among the most persistent of these is the accusation of what has been called debt trap diplomacy, the suggestion that China deliberately extends loans to countries that cannot repay them and then extracts strategic concessions when those countries inevitably default. And the case most frequently cited in support of this accusation is that of Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, where a major harbour facility was constructed with Chinese loans during the administration of President Mahinda Rajapaksa, and when the Sri Lankan government found itself unable to service the resulting debt, it agreed in the year 2017 to lease the port to a Chinese company for a period of 99 years. A term that echoed uncomfortably, for many observers, the colonial-era concessions that Western powers once extracted from Asian nations, though the Chinese government and its supporters have disputed this characterization, arguing that the Hambantota arrangement was a commercial transaction freely entered into by both parties and that Sri Lanka's debt problem stemmed from many sources beyond its dealings with China. And the truth of the matter is probably more complex than either simple narrative would suggest. As is often the case with matters of international finance and geopolitical maneuvering, the revival of the Silk Road has brought with it, somewhat unexpectedly, a renewed interest in the archaeological heritage of the ancient routes. And Chinese scholars have in recent years conducted extensive excavations at sites across the western regions of their country and beyond, uncovering new evidence of the commercial and cultural exchanges that once flowed along these pathways. And this academic work has been accompanied by significant investment in tourism infrastructure, transforming places that were once remote and difficult of access into popular destinations for both domestic and international visitors. So that the town of Dunhuang, which guards the entrance to the Mogoro caves with their 1,000 years of Buddhist art, now receives millions of tourists annually, and the ancient city of Kasha, with its old town and its famous Sunday market, has been extensively restored and developed. Though critics note that some of this restoration has come at the cost of authenticity, replacing genuine historical fabric with modern reconstructions that present a somewhat sanitized and stage-managed version of the past. And similar tourism development has occurred at numerous other sites along the old routes, creating a kind of Silk Road heritage trail that visitors can follow, experiencing, in carefully curated form, the landscapes and the monuments that the ancient traders once knew. It is perhaps worth noting, as we consider this revival of connectivity and exchange, a certain irony in the situation of modern China. For while the government in Beijing has invested so heavily in promoting physical connectivity, in building roads and railways and ports that link nations together, it has simultaneously maintained one of the most comprehensive systems of internet control in the world. The so-called Great Firewall that restricts the access of Chinese citizens to foreign websites and social media platforms and information sources. And so even as goods flow ever more freely across borders, even as trains carry their containers from Yiwu to Madrid and ships sail from Shanghai to Guadar, the digital realm remains carefully bounded and patrolled. And this paradox, this simultaneous opening and closing, is something that observers have remarked upon with varying degrees of concern and bemusement, for it suggests that the vision of the Silk Road being promoted is one of selective connectivity, of exchange on terms carefully controlled and monitored, rather than the free-flowing commerce of ideas and information that the historical Silk Road, at its best, once fostered. The geopolitical dimensions of the Belt and Road Initiative have become increasingly prominent in recent years, particularly in the context of tensions between China and the United States, where officials and analysts have expressed concern about the expansion of Chinese influence and the strategic implications of Beijing's growing network of ports and railways and economic partnerships. And these concerns have led to various counter-initiatives and alternative proposals, though none has yet matched the scale or the coherence of the Chinese program. And so the Belt and Road has become, in some sense, a focal point of great power competition, a terrain on which the major nations of the world contest for influence and position, much as the original Silk Road once served as a space of rivalry between empires. And it remains to be seen how these tensions will ultimately resolve themselves, though that is a matter for waking hours and anxious analysis rather than for our gentle consideration here. The environmental challenges facing the overland routes deserve mention as well, for the construction of railways and highways across sensitive ecosystems, the development of industrial facilities in regions of water scarcity, the increased emissions from transportation activities. All of these raise questions about the sustainability of the connectivity being promoted. And while Chinese officials have spoken of a green belt and road and of environmental standards for overseas projects, The implementation of these commitments has been uneven, and the environmental impacts of development continue to accumulate in ways that will concern future generations. In the year 2014, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, which is more commonly known by its acronym UNESCO, added sections of the Silk Road to its World Heritage List, recognizing the outstanding universal value of these ancient routes. And this designation brought together sites in China and Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, acknowledging the transnational character of this heritage. And it is fitting, perhaps, that even as new railways and highways are being built, the old routes are receiving this formal recognition, this acknowledgement that they represent something precious and irreplaceable, a legacy of human enterprise and cultural exchange that we inherit from all those countless merchants and pilgrims and envoys who once traveled these pathways, carrying their goods and their beliefs and their hopes across the vast spaces of the Eurasian continent. And now, as we draw this section toward its close, we may simply rest in the recognition that the Silk Road, in one form or another, continues to evolve, continues to connect, continues to serve as a pathway for the movement of goods and ideas between East and West. And whatever the future may hold for the Belt and Road Initiative, whatever geopolitical fortunes may rise or fall, the fundamental human impulse toward connection and exchange will persist, as it has persisted for millennia. And with that gentle thought we may let our minds settle into stillness.